All right, and I believe we are live. So hello, everyone, and please allow me to welcome you to the capstone presentations for the McMaster University Master of Public Policy and Digital Society program. We're delighted to have you join us today, and we're delighted to have the opportunity to showcase the incredible work of our 2026 graduating class. I'm also very pleased to welcome our judges who have taken time to be with us today to provide feedback on the presentations in real time and to score them. Unfortunately, our first judge, just in alphabetical order here, our first judge, Vas Bednar, due to a last-minute family complication, was not able to join us. I am grateful that our executive director of the MPP program, Graham Stewart, has kindly volunteered to jump in at the last minute and serve in her stead as a judge for today's showcase. Vas has promised to review the recording and to get back to each of the presenters with her own feedback on their presentations. But for today's live session and back and forth, Graham has kindly agreed to step in and support the presentations. So let me very briefly introduce our judges. First of all, I will say that many of you know Graham already, who is standing in for Vas as the executive director of the MPP program. He has a decorated career in public policy, both within and outside government. He served as Director of Policy for the Minister of Advanced Education and Skills Development under the Wynne government, and since has held senior leadership roles at Ontario universities, including as Chief of Staff to the President of York University and AVP Government Relations and Economic Development at the University of Waterloo. Next, we have Manon Paquette. Manon, thank you for joining us. Manon is a career public servant who has held senior leadership roles in the federal government, including as Chief of Staff to the Deputy Minister of Canadian Heritage, as Director of Special Projects within the Privy Council Office's Democratic Institutions Secretariat, and in her current role, also within the PCO, as the Director of the Protecting Democracy Unit. And Manon and I go way back to almost a decade ago of having the opportunity to work together on some very interesting files, and I'm grateful, Manon, for you to be with us today. Mark Sermon needs no introduction to most of you who know him through his role on our advisory board, but Mark is the president of Mozilla, a nonprofit that includes public benefit companies like Firefox, Thunderbird, and open source AI developer tools. It also includes a venture fund that invests in double bottom line tech companies. And it's a global foundation that backs the work of artists, educators, and builders. Mark works across this whole portfolio, and he has also served as the executive director of the Mozilla Foundation for 15 years, where he grew the organization into an international movement building force. In addition to being an advocate for an open internet, he is also more recently one of the, I would say, the world's leading advocates for open sourcing and creating a public AI infrastructure. So for the past 3 decades, he has been at the forefront of thinking about how the future of the internet should unfold in order to be a public benefit and something that serves citizens. And he continues to do so as the internet and digital technologies evolve. Mark, you've been a great friend to the Master of Public Policy program at McMaster since its inception, including as a professor of practice and an advisory board member. And we're so grateful to have you and your insights here today as our students present their capstone projects.
I'm happy to be here.
So much. So a brief note to our judges. Our judges all already have scoring cards for our students. They also have a list of whether they are first reader or second reader on any particular presentation. So we'll move right to the presentations after a very brief overview of what students were expected to do, just to reiterate for our judges the expectations for these projects. Over the past several months of the Capstone course, students have been thinking through emergent policy challenges or policy problems related in some way, shape, or form to digital technology. And they've been working through the steps, at least the conceptual steps of the policy design process. So they've been working on problem definition, on setting objectives or policy goals, on identifying policy alternatives or policy options. They've conducted thorough and rigorous analysis of those options and are set to make a recommendation here today. So each student will go through their presentation. They will have a maximum of 10 minutes to present their work, and they will then we'll then turn the floor over to the judges for their feedback. And you're welcome to ask students questions. You're welcome to provide just your general thoughts that could help them inform their final written report, which is due in 2 weeks. And I will chair the sessions and ensure that between the presenter and the judge's feedback, we don't go over the 15-minute mark. That said, we're already 3 minutes behind in a very tight schedule, so I'm going to get going and turn the floor over to Renee, who will be our first presenter. Renee, I'm going to give you control of the screen. In order to advance your slides, simply use the arrow buttons. Use the right button to move forward and or the left button to move back.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So today I'll be walking you through my capstone, which examines how Canada should respond to the emergence of agentic AI in digital commerce. Artificial intelligence is increasingly moving beyond tools that simply generate information. Instead, we're starting to see AI agents that can autonomously perform tasks on behalf of users, and these are starting to be increasingly integrated into workflows and even consumption. AI agents are systems that can interpret instructions and carry out multi-step tasks autonomously once given a goal. Unlike generative AI tools that primarily produce text or images, AI agents can act within digital environments, such as searching websites, comparing options, and preparing transactions. For example, a user might give an instruction such as, find the cheapest flight to Vancouver under $400 this weekend. And the agent could then search multiple travel websites, compare routes and prices, and bring the best option to the checkout page for the user to confirm. Traditionally, digital commerce follows a simple structure. A consumer interacts with an online platform and then makes a purchase. However, agentic commerce introduces an additional decision-making layer where customers may delegate purchasing tasks to an AI agent that interacts with the platforms on their behalf. While this technology is still emerging, there are signs of growing consumer interest. A 2025 KPMG survey of Canadian shoppers found that 78% expect to use AI for holiday shopping, and 31% reported being curious about agentic AI, suggesting increasing interest in automated purchasing. The policy challenge here is that Canada's consumer protection and competition frameworks were designed around human-initiated transactions. When AI agents begin shaping purchasing decisions, this creates new regulatory gaps around consumer authorization, accountability, transparency of automated decisions, and oversight of algorithmic market behavior, and ultimately raise the question of whether existing protections are sufficient. To evaluate possible regulatory responses to this shift towards delegated decision-making in commerce, I developed the following 5 policy objectives. First is preserving consumer control and authorization, ensuring users determine when and how AI agents act on their behalf. Second, maintaining consumer protection in automated transactions, particularly when purchases are completed by autonomous systems. Third, ensuring competitive and transparent digital markets, especially if AI agents begin interacting with one another in pricing or purchasing environments. Fourth, providing regulatory clarity for firms, since companies developing these systems need clear governance expectations. And finally, maintaining public trust in digital commerce, which is essential if these technologies are to be widely adopted. The first option is simply maintaining the status quo. Under this approach, existing laws such as consumer protection legislation, privacy law, and the Competition Act would continue to apply, but no new rules would specifically address AI agents. Issues would be handled through case-by-case enforcement and judicial interpretation as problems emerge. The strength of this option is that it avoids imposing new regulatory burdens and allows innovation to develop organically, but current frameworks were designed for human actors in digital markets, not autonomous agents. Thus, many important issues remain legally ambiguous. The second option focuses on consumer authorization and transaction safeguards. Under this approach, regulations would ensure that users maintain clear control over AI agents conducting purchases. For example, consumers could set spending limits, approved vendors, or authorization rules for transactions. Some additional safeguards might include identity verification and dispute resolution mechanisms for unauthorized purchases. This option strongly supports consumer autonomy, but it does not fully address broader market concerns such as competition issues. The third option focuses on modernizing competition policy. This approach would expand the Competition Bureau's oversight to address emerging risks such as agent-to-agent or tacit collusion between AI systems. In markets where AI systems interact autonomously, pricing behavior may emerge even without direct human coordination. Studies using simulated market environments show that algorithms can sometimes converge on strategies that resemble collusion. Strengthening investigative tools and regulatory guidance could help ensure that AI-driven markets remain competitive. However, this option focuses primarily on the market competition aspect and does not directly address consumer protection or governance issues surrounding the design and deployment of AI agents. The fourth option is the most hands-on, with establishing an agent governance and oversight framework. This approach creates a structured governance model for AI agents operating in digital commerce. Some key elements could include identifiable agent markers or IDs, so platforms know when they are interacting with AI systems, monitoring or activity logging requirements, data governance rules, deploy responsibilities, and certification requirements for higher risk systems. This framework addresses the problem more holistically by establishing clear accountability and oversight structures. Importantly, it also creates regulatory clarity for firms developing these technologies while still allowing innovation to continue. However, there are significant compliance costs for companies and high administrative burden for the government as well. The final option is industry co-regulation. In this model, industries would develop standards and best practices for AI agents, while government would provide oversight and auditing authority. This approach can encourage flexibility and innovation, since firms often understand the technology better than regulators. And this is a similar approach to how the government goes about content moderation on platforms. A limitation in this is that it relies heavily on voluntary compliance, which may not be sufficient to address systemic risks or ensure consistent standards across the industry. Based on the evaluation of these alternatives, my recommendation is option 4, an agent governance and oversight framework. This option best balances the policy objectives identified earlier. It provides transparency in how agents operate, accountability in how agents operate, accountability for firms deploying these systems, safeguards to protect consumers, and oversight mechanisms to maintain fair digital markets. Oversight would likely build on existing regulatory institutions. For example, the Competition Bureau could address competition concerns in AI-driven markets. Innovation, Science, and Economic Development Canada could develop the broader regulatory framework and standards, and the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada could oversee privacy and data governance. That said, this approach does involve some trade-offs. It assumes that agentic AI will be widely adopted, which remains uncertain, and monitoring requirements may raise privacy concerns due to the need for activity logging and auditing. Compliance requirements could also create fixed infrastructure costs, potentially raising the barrier for smaller firms. However, despite these trade-offs, establishing clear governance early helps prevent harmful practices, especially for low-income or disadvantaged individuals, from becoming embedded in digital markets. It can also increase consumer trust and provide regulatory certainty for firms, both of which are essential for responsible innovation. So in conclusion, AI agents are already beginning to transform how transactions occur in digital markets. Effective policy will need to balance innovation, consumer protection, and competition. And if governments act proactively, it is possible to support innovation while still preserving trust and fairness. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Renee, and thank you not only for the excellent presentation, but for also dealing so graciously with some of the slide issues at the beginning. I appreciate your patience with that. I'm going to invite Mark as first reader on this. So Mark, I'm just going to spotlight you. There we go. And I'm going to, you should be ready to unmute your mic now.
There we go. Sorry about that. Thank you for the presentation. That was very on point for what's going on right now. So, and certainly something we're thinking about a lot of Mozilla is just sort of how we give people control and protect them as we potentially lean more in on agents. So I really enjoyed the conversation. I guess if I was taking my Mozilla hat off and being a senior policymaker taking your recommendation, what I might say is like, I really need something that is going to make my government look good soon and feel like we're getting our arms around this. And recommendation 4 feels like it's a very complicated, long game. If it, we look at how long it has taken us to just get privacy regulation in this country, I worry, I think you've really clearly identified all the different agencies and players that would be needed to take option 4 to reality. And as as the person who you're presenting this to, I would love to see option 4 happen. But I'm wondering if you had a second choice that was really pragmatically letting us as a government dive into this issue swiftly and kind of manage the biggest risks, but in a way that we could act on, let's say, over the course of a year. What would your second recommendation be?
Mm-hmm. I would say that the second option that I would recommend that could be implemented a little bit faster would be option 3. So that was the Competition Act modernization. I think the Competition Bureau's capacity to, oh, okay, that wasn't me.
That's helpful.
Sorry, for enforcement is quite broad. So instead of creating an entirely new sort of governance framework, just developing maybe a little task force or getting a couple experts on, let's say, algorithmic pricing or automated market interactions. There's been a lot of articles from simulated markets with AIs colluding with each other to sort of price fix or like taking turns. So I think those are really serious issues, but they fall underneath the Competition Bureau. So this is something that could be implemented sooner to kind of govern these kind of larger, more systemic issues. And it would be a good starting place to kind of test how governance could work and potentially later on moving towards something like option 4.
Well, let me just say one thing on that, and I'll let Graham, who's the second reader, dive in there. But I guess that, or maybe it's say/ask. I guess I wonder in that, what are the specific new competition issues that come up that are not covered by the law right now? And when we talk about agents colluding, it's really, I think in most cases, those agents have been created by companies. And so the companies already are regulated to not be able to collude. And in fact, what's interesting is they may be colluding without their knowledge right now. That creates a legal risk for them. I mean, if I was the compliance people for somebody deploying AI agents, I'd be really worried about my agents colluding because I'm on the hook for that. So I guess, what are some of the new issues that come up that I'm not on the hook for now under current competition law?
I think obviously that you kind of touched on with the collusion. I think another one is with platform ranking and product visibility. So at the start of this year, ChatGPT introduced ads for like their non-paid users. And I think that's a shift towards possibly people getting more and more recommendations for purchasing from AI. We've seen search engine optimization change into generative engine optimization. So now how do we optimize websites for AI to scrape your website? And I think if agents are adopted more and more, I believe it was 2 weeks ago when the courts in the US ruled in favor of Amazon against a lawsuit for Perplexity's Comet agent browser to not let their agent browse Amazon using someone's personal account. So this is something that's kind of happening, and legal changes are already being, like these decisions are being made. So with that platform ranking, consumers don't really know what to look for a lot of the times. We tend to click things at the very top. I think that's why deceptive marketing is a huge concern and risk. So I think that's another part that the Competition Act could be amended to directly address, like now not only search engine optimization, but generative engine optimization, and whether or not it's okay to maybe write your code for your website or add in certain text to purposely try to get an agent or an AI to promote your product over another.
Great. Well, I could talk about this for hours, but we can't. So I'll pass it to Graham, but thank you so much.
Well, actually, I'm
Thank
going to
you.
intervene there and say, just given time, Reader 2 is sort of an overflow option. So
Okay.
we made sure that we gave Renee 3 extra minutes, accounting for the 3 extra minutes that delay in her start. But we'll move now to the next presenter, and we'll thank you, Mark, and thank you, Renee, for the excellent presentation. To the judges, I would say at this point, please feel free to put in your scores or your tentative scores, and we will move now to just let me get the spotlight set up. We will move now to Salma. So you're spotlighted, Salma, and we will get you set up so you can control the screen. I will do my best not to interfere this time, and you can just hit your cursor or arrow buttons to advance to the next slide.
Perfect. Bear with me if I'm messing around with the keyboard. But okay, I'm gonna get started now. So hello, today I'll be presenting my policy analysis on AI-enabled wearable technologies, specifically smart glasses, and the challenges they pose for Canada's privacy framework. The focus of this analysis is how existing consent-based privacy laws struggle to govern continuous ambient recording in everyday spaces. These technologies challenge how Canada's privacy framework applies consent and accountability in everyday environments, where recording is continuous and often unnoticed.
Did you get control of the?
I don't think I have it. Oh my God.
Okay,
Okay, now I have it. I didn't have it before.
All right, I just reinitiated it, so you should be able to accept control and then.
You want to share that again? Because I didn't get it.
Sure. Okay, so I'm going to try one more time. You should get a little note saying that you have control.
Okay.
And once you accept control, you should be able to cursor over the screen and just advance to the next slide. But if it's not working for you, then no problem. You can just say next, and I'll advance for you.
Yeah, so yeah, it's not working. So
okay. Well, sorry about that.
No, thank you. Alrighty, so what's important here is that this isn't hypothetical, it's already happening. We're seeing cases where people are being recorded by smart glasses without knowing, and these devices are designed to look almost identical to regular glasses. And at the same time, companies are starting to explore features like facial recognition, which makes these concerns even more serious. So the issue isn't just the technology itself, it's how quickly it's being integrated into everyday life without clear expectations around privacy. So the question isn't whether this is a privacy issue, it's whether our current rules are actually equipped to deal with it. Moving on to the next slide. So with this in mind, let's look at the policy context. Canada's current privacy framework was not designed for AI-enabled wearable technologies that enable ambient recording. While privacy laws like the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, PIPEDA, are consent-based and technology-neutral, they were built around more traditional forms of data collection like cameras, where individuals are aware of when data is being collected and can meaningfully provide consent. However, wearable technologies like smart glasses enable continuous real-time audio, visual, and contextual data capturing in public and semi-public environments, often without individuals' awareness. This means the core assumptions of privacy law, particularly meaningful consent, no longer hold in practice. As a result, individuals may be recorded without consent, accountability becomes unclear across actors and data flows, and privacy protections are weakened, especially when data is stored through foreign and cloud infrastructures, which raises national security risks. And this matters because these gaps are not just theoretical, they affect how privacy is experienced in everyday environments and whether existing laws can actually be enforced in practice. And PIPEDA is outdated as it was designed in the year 2001, and its last meaningful update was 2015. So moving on to the next slide for policy objectives. There are a few important considerations to flag before I go into the objectives in terms of the remaining context. Given this problem, any policy response has to operate within several important constraints in Canada's privacy system. First, privacy law is divided between federal and provincial governments, which creates fragmentation and limits the ability to fully harmonize protections across jurisdictions. Second, wearable AI often moves across borders and is stored by foreign cloud providers, which makes accountability and oversight more complex. And third, policy responses must balance protecting privacy while still allowing innovation and economic activity to continue. With these constraints in mind, I evaluated the policy options based off of 5 criteria. First, clarity of consent in practice. Whether people can actually tell they are being recorded and meaningfully give consent in everyday situations. Second, consistency across jurisdictions. So whether privacy protections are applied more uniformly across provinces. Third, interpretive clarity. Whether individuals, organizations, or regulators can clearly understand how existing privacy law applies to wearable AI tech. Fourth, traceable accountability. Whether responsibility for data can be clearly identified even when it moves across borders. And finally, public trust and innovation. Whether the approach maintains confidence in privacy governance while still allowing technological development to continue. So moving on to the next slide, now I'm going to walk through the main approaches to addressing this problem. The first option is the status quo, so maintaining it. This keeps the current privacy framework in place and relies on existing consent rules and a complaint-based enforcement. The assumption here is that PIPEDA's technology-neutral approach can adapt to wearable AI over time, but in practice, this approach doesn't resolve the core issues we identified, which is that continuous ambient recording makes meaningful consent very difficult and accountability remains unclear, especially when data moves across borders. The second approach, on the next slide, focuses on consent and interpretive clarity for wearable AI. It uses regulatory guidance to clarify how consent applies in continuous and often less visible recording environments, such as public transit, gyms, workplaces, or retail settings. Its strength is that it directly reduces confusion around when individuals are being recorded and what meaningful consent looks like in practice. However, because this approach is not legally binding, there is no guarantee that organizations will apply it consistently. As a result, compliance may be uneven and its overall impact is limited. The third approach on the next slide focuses on accountability for cross-border data flows. It clarifies which organizations remain responsible for personal data throughout its life cycle, even when that data is stored or processed outside of Canada. Its strength is that it improves traceability across multiple actors and makes it clearer who can be held accountable when issues arise. However, this approach does not address how data is collected in the first place, so consent challenges in everyday recording environment remain, again, unresolved. Moving on to the next slide. Rather than changing the law itself, coordinated oversight across jurisdictions improves how regulators work together through mechanisms like joint guidance, shared enforcement priorities, and ongoing coordination between the Office of the Privacy Commissioner and provincial regulators. Its strength is that it directly targets fragmentation, which is a key issue in Canada's privacy framework, but by aligning how rules are interpreted and applied, it can create more consistent expectations for organizations across provinces. However, this approach relies on sustained coordination between jurisdictions. Because regulators still operate under different legal frameworks, coordination alone cannot eliminate inconsistencies. It also does not directly address consent challenges in everyday environments or accountability concerns related to cross-border data flows. The final approach on the next slide is federal statutory reform. This would involve amending PIPEDA to explicitly address wearable AI and define how consent applies in continuous recording contexts. This approach most directly resolves the legal ambiguity by creating enforceable rules tailored to these technologies, but it also introduces trade-offs, including longer implementation timelines, higher compliance costs, and the risk that legislation may struggle to keep up with the rapidly evolving technologies. So across these options, the key difference is how directly each approach addresses the gap between continuous data collection and a consent-based legal framework. This brings me to the recommendation, which is federal statutory reform. Specifically, amending PIPEDA to explicitly address AI-enabled wearable tech and ambient recording. This approach is recommended because it directly resolves the core issues identified, which is that continuous and often unnoticed data collection cannot be effectively governed through existing consent frameworks. By clearly defining how consent applies in these contexts and by introducing enforceable obligations, this approach aligns the legal framework with how these technologies actually operate in practice. However, at the same time, this recommendation involves important trade-offs. Legislative reform requires time, coordination, and introducing burdens for organizations. There's also a risk that legal frameworks may struggle to keep up with the pace of rapidly evolving tech. However, compared to the alternatives, this approach provides the most effective and durable solution to the governance gap, while still allowing for innovation within a clear and more predictable regulatory framework. So, and before concluding, there are some additional risks and constraints to acknowledge with this approach in further detail. First, legislative reform takes time. On the next slide, please. Legislative reform takes time and requires coordination across federal institutions and indirectly with provinces. This creates a timing gap where wearable tech continue to be used while legal standards are still being developed. To mitigate this, interim regulatory guidance can provide immediate clarity on how consent and accountability should be interpreted in practice while the legislation is being finalized. Second, there's a compliance burden for organizations. Firms deploying wearable tech will need to adjust their data practices, which may create short-term costs and resistance. However, over time, clear legal standards can reduce uncertainties and compliance disputes. Third, there's a risk that technology evolves, which we see right now, faster than legislation. If legal rules are too specific, they may become outdated as wearable devices become smaller, more automated, or less visible. This can be mitigated by using principle-based legal language, which focuses on outcomes like meaningful consent and accountability, rather than prescribing specific technical requirements. Additionally, seeking guidance from other successful frameworks in the meantime, like the EU GDPR, where they do address wearable technology, smart glasses. So while these risks are real, they are manageable and do not outweigh the benefits of establishing clear, enforceable privacy protections. With that said, I would like to close by saying thank you for your time and now open the floor for questions and feedback.
Thank you very much. Perfectly timed. Let's invite Manon. I'm going to add you to the spotlight. I invite you for commentary, Manon.
Awesome. Thank you for this presentation. It's very interesting and very much an issue that is top of mind. So we should bring you to Minister Joly so you can present it directly to her to make the case. So in terms of the presentation itself, like a couple of items that I think you may want to consider in terms of like in doing your final paper that I'd be curious to hear more about, because you mentioned them at the beginning, but it just doesn't necessarily carry through to the recommendation. It's the federal provincial aspect of it. So you had a recommendation, an option that was specific to that. But I think I'm curious to see how you would square that with your recommended option, because like PIPEDA cannot necessarily provide the final like answer for everything, in the sense that there's a few provinces where PIPEDA does not apply. So how do we square that circle, like in terms of like, and then it's not necessarily to change your recommendation, but to sort of acknowledge that it's sort of that issue would still be like a challenge. And the other piece that also I'd be curious, like I was really excited to hear how you would consider achieving this, is that aspect of balancing the trust and innovation. Because the first argument that we will hear when we propose issues related to like action on privacy in these types of issues is that innovation, like we don't want to lag behind other countries because we're putting privacy regulations that are stronger and will like limit the possibility to innovate in Canada, right? So that's always the first argument that we hear. So like again, carrying it through towards your analysis towards the recommendation, I think would help build the argument for that, the reform that you're suggesting under the legislation. But overall, I think it was a very strong presentation. Thank you for doing this. Oh, I guess I had one little point I wanted to mention. Sorry, and like and it's about contextualizing the reform. So I'm not an expert on privacy at all, but my understanding is there are other related areas that also are in need of stronger privacy regulations that also in the pipelines for, there's different stakeholders. Obviously, I work in democratic institutions. The first one that comes to mind is privacy and political parties. There's a lot of stakeholders asking for stronger privacy regulations in a number of areas. So would we suggest like targeted to address only wearables, or we do suggest including it as part of a broader privacy reform that includes other pieces as well. So in terms of like, would your recommendation to the government be in that respect? Because it affects timelines. The bigger, the more ambitious the project, obviously the longer it takes. So where like how urgent is this one in relation to other pieces? So I guess that would be my thoughts on this one.
Thank you for your thoughts. These are all things I have thought about in my analysis. I'll do my best to answer as briefly as possible with the time. So first, with the federal, the fragmentation, this is actually the core issue in how my capstone came to be. Like in December, I actually wrote a paper on legal fragmentation between jurisdictions. So I think my knowledge in federal privacy law is pretty decent. So yes, most of Canada doesn't actually follow. I mean, most of Canada follows PIPEDA-based approaches, except for Quebec, Alberta, and BC. BC and Alberta have their own PIPA, and then Quebec has their Law 25. Law 25 has strong AI protections, doesn't really address wearables, but PIPA is more law-based principles. So the reason why I really wanted to focus on PIPEDA and making amendments to PIPEDA is because most of the country does seek guidance in terms of privacy from the federal government, including BC and Alberta, because their approaches are very principle-based and very, very basic. So if the government of Canada does issue stronger privacy legislation within PIPEDA, the rest of the country will indirectly have a ripple effect and follow that guidance and make their documentation stronger, including Quebec, because their AI-related like protections are more about automated decision-making and more like employment. So that's to answer question number one. That's why. Number two,
I'm going to have to stop us there, but I appreciate that response, Salma. And what I would encourage you to do is reach out to Manon or share your final report with her, so maybe it can get forwarded along to Minister Joly. So thank you very much, Manon, and thank you very much, Salma, for the excellent presentation. I'm going to bring Anna Maria into the spotlight and just move everyone else for a moment. And Anna Maria, I'm going to try to share control and see what happens. Are you able to take control of the screen?
I didn't get a notification asking me for control.
Okay, then let's just very quickly try to reshare and see if that fixes it. And if not, we'll advance in a more conventional sense. Anything?
No.
Oh, I see you have control though.
Oh, do
So
I? Okay.
If you can hit the right cursor and just test it. Yeah, okay, perfect.
Okay. And then I can just start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so thank you. Today I will be presenting my policy analysis on the impact of AI-driven recommender systems on youth in Canada and evaluate policy options to address the risks they create. So youth are increasingly relying on social media for information. These platforms use recommender systems, which are algorithms that learn from user behavior and prioritize content that is most likely to keep users engaged. What makes these systems distinct is that they operate at scale, adapt in real time, and create highly personalized information environments. And the diagram in the middle shows the process. So user behavior data, such as likes and comments, are tracked, and the system uses that data to rank what content is most likely to generate engagement. And then that content is amplified, pushing the most engaging content more widely and repeatedly. And the result is a personalized feed where each user is exposed to a curated set of content shaped by these engagement signals. The cycle then repeats, making harms more persistent and difficult to regulate. This engagement-driven design promotes emotionally charged content regardless of accuracy or age appropriateness, increasing exposure to misinformation, harmful, and polarized content. Over time, recommender systems play a significant role in influencing youth beliefs about society, shapes their perceptions of social and political issues, and affects trust in institutions. However, Canada's frameworks were designed for earlier forms of social media and do not adequately address the risks that AI-driven recommender systems pose to youth. To address this problem, I focus on 4 key objectives. Objective 1 is that youth in Canada are exposed to measurably lower levels of harmful, misleading, and developmentally inappropriate content in personalized content feeds. Objective 2 is that the effects of AI-driven recommender systems on youth information environments are transparent and accessible to regulators, researchers, and the public. Objective 3 is that responsibility for systemic harms to youth arising from recommender systems can be clearly identified, assessed, and attributed through oversight and governance processes. And fourth is that youth are recognized as a distinct, vulnerable, and unique population within the governance and oversight of recommender systems. So next, I will evaluate 5 policy options based on the criteria set by these objectives. So the first option is the status quo, which maintains Canada's current approach to governing recommender systems. This option avoids legal, political, and regulatory conflict, which reflects Canada's current fragmented policy landscape. But it does not reduce harmful content exposure for youth, improve transparency, assign responsibility for harms, or recognize youth as a distinct population. Therefore, while the status quo is a safe option and highly feasible, it offers minimal progress on the core problem and does not advance the objectives, as seen by the blank boxes on the slide. This makes it a baseline for comparing other options. The second option is design constraints, which involves directly regulating platform engagement-based ranking, amplification, and personalization. As seen by the highlighted objective boxes, it advances objectives 1 and 4. It is the strongest option from a harm reduction and youth perspective because it targets the root cause, which is the algorithm itself. However, it has the biggest challenges as well. Recommender systems and technology in general evolves quickly, and it would need constant updates to regulation. Social media companies also have the money and resources to challenge or resist regulations. Therefore, while this option could deliver the highest impact and strongest harm reduction for youth, it is also the hardest to implement and sustain based on Canada's current policy environment, making it less feasible. The third option is transparency, which requires platforms to provide risk assessments, data, and documentation on how AI-driven recommender systems shape youth information environments. This option advances objectives 2 and 3 and improves visibility into an area that is currently difficult for regulators and researchers to assess. Transparency can help establish responsibility for how platform practices may be contributing to youth harms. However, this alone does not force platforms to change their behavior and depends on government capacity to act on the information. Therefore, the trade-off is higher feasibility, but more indirect impact on harm reduction. The fourth option is proactive risk management, which requires platforms to assess, mitigate, and demonstrate reductions in foreseeable harms to youth arising from recommender systems. This would include ongoing risk assessments, independent audits, and performance benchmarks for platforms. This option advances objectives 1, 2, and 3. It targets harm reduction, assigns responsibility to platforms, and can improve transparency through reporting. However, it depends heavily on its implementation. Concepts like foreseeable harms require clear definitions, and regulators need to have capacity to assess and enforce platform compliance. Therefore, while the option provides strong harm reduction, platform accountability, and improves transparency into recommender systems, it requires clear standards and consistent enforcement. The final option is youth agency, and this option focuses on strengthening youth capacity to understand and respond to recommender systems and requires platforms to introduce options for them to reduce, reset, or disengage from personalized content feeds. It advances objectives 1, 2, and 4. It recognizes youth as a distinct and vulnerable population, supports youth autonomy, and it can reduce exposure to harmful content, but relies on individual behavior, which can become inconsistent. So while this option is important from a youth perspective, its success depends on whether youth actually use the tools provided, whether they understand them, and whether platforms design them in a meaningful way and accessible way. Therefore, the trade-off is that this option can empower users, but it has more limited and inconsistent effects on harm reduction. So based on my analysis and evaluations, I recommend proactive risk management. This would require platforms to conduct ongoing risk assessments related to content personalization and amplification, implement measures to mitigate foreseeable harms to youth, demonstrate how they are reducing youth exposure to harmful content, and be subject to regulatory oversight. This option offers the strongest balance between impact and feasibility in the Canadian policy context. It offers the ability to directly assign responsibility to platforms for managing systemic risks to youth that are embedded within recommender systems without requiring governments to regulate its design. It advances 3 out of 4 objectives and shifts governance away from reacting to harms after they occur toward requiring platforms to manage risks in advance. Canada currently lacks a comprehensive framework for governing recommender systems, and current approaches are shaped by institutional lag, fragmented authority, and platform power. In that environment, a proactive risk management approach is more realistic from a governance perspective while still ensuring a meaningful impact on youth harm reduction. It also aligns with broader public support, and based on the 2025 Survey of Online Harms in Canada, 69% of Canadians believe the government should intervene to require online platforms to act responsibly. It is important to note, though, that the recommendation does involve trade-offs. So by choosing this approach over direct design constraints, it gives up the possibility of immediate harm reduction for youth. And its success also depends on regulator capacity to define standards, assess compliance, and enforce obligations consistently. However, even within those limitations, this is the option that meaningfully changes platform behavior while remaining realistically implementable in Canada's current policy environment. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions and feedback.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Anna Maria. Let's invite Graham, who is first reader on your file in lieu of Vas, to respond.
Just think of me as Vas light. So, yeah. So, hi, Anna, and thanks for the presentation. Really well done. I like that it cut to the problem, very quickly, very incisively. Good statement of that. And I think everything was laid out really clearly and highlighted well. A question I had, which I've actually had about, I think all of the presentations so far is this question of enforcement. When we're trying to impose sort of national legislative or policy priorities on companies that may take the view that they are not Canadian and therefore not subject to our laws. I'm not looking for a response to that, but just a comment generally that's an issue that we have. I think where you landed is a great and feasible and impactful position. The one thing I was struck is that there's an additional policy response which we've seen in some other jurisdictions, which is to actually prevent youth from accessing these systems altogether. So Australia being the kind of notable one, and I guess I would. I'm not saying you should have done, but I'm just asking why you wouldn't have sort of put that on your list of priorities or proposals. Sorry.
Yeah, so Australia's approach was definitely something that I was considering when I was doing my analysis. And the reason why I didn't go through with that is because those restrictions kind of target a different problem than the recommender system and the harms that those cause. So those ones are about accessing platforms, whereas this one is like the environments that users encounter once they're already on a platform. And I think age verification is tricky as well because they're difficult to implement without creating kind of other risks as well, that people will lie about their age and things like that. So in that context, that those things might occur, that people might be lying about the age verification and things like that. My recommendation kind of targets the design of the environment itself. So that would apply to youth on the platform, including those who would access it regardless of the age restrictions or bans that could potentially be an option as well. But yeah, and maybe if later on down the road, if this option is implemented and there is the need for a ban, it still allows for it to go towards that as well.
Great. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Sorry, I was muted. So we actually are now just about to catch up to time, and then I'm going to throw a spanner in the works by saying, Manon, there's a minute or two if you have, as reader two, if you have any comments that you'd like to share, any feedback for Anna.
Sure. Just one little idea that you may want to take on, but for your recommended option, I think there might be a way that you can make it to your four objectives being achieved through this, where you could require the platform that as part of their risk assessment that they consider use as a specific population with certain vulnerabilities, then therefore you'd sort of hit your 4 objectives. And it looks even more impressive as a recommendation. Just an idea.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. That's helpful.
This is where experience becomes an excellent teacher. All right. Well, thank you, Anna. Thank you, Graham and Manon, for your comments. I'm going to get set up now for our next speaker, which is Mikaila. This is a more manual process than I had hoped, so thank you everyone for your patience. Mikaila, you are now spotlighted, and I will endeavor to give you control. Let's see if that works. I see you have control, so you should be able to cursor forward or click.
I have control, but it's not moving.
Oh, there we go.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Okay, and I'll just start whenever.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'll be presenting my capstone project on preparing Ontario students for an AI-driven world. Artificial intelligence is already in Ontario classrooms, but the education system hasn't kept up. In this analysis, AI literacy refers to students' ability to understand how AI works at a basic level, critically evaluate its outputs, recognize risks such as bias, misinformation, and privacy concerns, and use these tools responsibly and effectively. Recent Canadian data shows that students are already using AI in their schoolwork, highlighting how quickly these tools are entering learning environments and eventually the workforce, with many reporting lower learning and uncertainty about appropriate use. At the same time, Ontario is investing heavily in AI, innovation, and economic competitiveness, making this gap between system priorities and student preparation increasingly urgent. Yet students are not being systematically prepared for this transition, and AI literacy is not being developed as a foundational skill. Education is a provincial responsibility. However, there is no clear province-wide approach to AI literacy in Ontario's K-12 classrooms. As a result, school boards and individual educators are left to interpret AI use independently, leading to uneven implementation across the province. Student exposure varies significantly depending on their school, board, and teacher. These gaps will further contribute to unequal student outcomes, particularly for students in under-resourced or higher needs communities. AI is already shaping how people learn, work, and access information and will only increase. Without AI literacy, students may struggle to recognize bias, misinformation, and privacy risks. This creates a growing gap between how AI is used in society and how students are prepared to engage with it, risking further inequalities across schools and communities. To address this gap, the policy approach needs to be guided by a clear and consistent set of objectives. First, all students should graduate with a basic understanding of AI, no matter where they go to school. Second, students need to be able to question AI outputs, including recognizing errors, bias, and misinformation. Third, students should know how to use AI safely and responsibly, including protecting their personal information. Fourth, there should be clear and consistent expectations for how AI can be used in schoolwork. And finally, educators need the training and support to actually teach these skills in the classroom. To address this problem, 5 policy approaches were considered, each prioritizing different objectives and trade-offs. The uncoordinated option maintains no new provincial action, preserving flexibility, but failing to address coordination. It performs poorly across all objectives, especially equity and consistency, and while it is highly feasible and low cost, it reinforces uneven student outcomes across the system. The guidance-focused option introduces a provincial framework and resource hub without requiring implementation. It improves coordination and supports educator capacity, but does not ensure equity. And while it is easy to implement, voluntary adoption leads to continued inconsistency. The integrity-focused option focuses on clear, province-wide rules for AI use in academic work. It strongly advances academic integrity and classroom clarity. However, it is too narrow as it does not build AI literacy or critical thinking skills. The capacity-focused option prioritizes educator training to build system capacity. It advances educator readiness through partnerships and supports long-term implementation. However, outcomes remain uneven since student exposure still depends on uptake and not requirements. Embedding AI literacy directly into the curriculum performs strongest on equity and consistency. However, it comes with lower feasibility, as it would require full curriculum reform. This process is time-intensive, resource-heavy, and disrupts alignment with Ontario's current introduced curriculum review cycle, making it slower to implement and less adaptable to rapidly evolving technology. The staged option introduces AI literacy in phases, combining guidance, minimum standards, and gradual curriculum integration. It is the only option that improves all 5 objectives in a feasible and coordinated way while aligning with the current curriculum review cycle. However, it requires sustained coordination over time with risk of delayed implementation in later phases. Based on analysis, the staged provincial AI literacy approach is recommended. It ensures that as AI becomes more embedded in society, the education system keeps pace in preparing all students equally. This approach sequences policy tools over time, with each phase addressing different system goals. The short term improves coordination and supports educator capacity. The medium term sets minimum standards to act as an introductory bridge while curriculum updates are underway, and the long term focuses on curriculum integration to ensure durable and system-wide outcomes. Most importantly, this approach aligns directly with Ontario's current policy priorities and recent budget investments. The province has already committed significant funding to broadband expansion, digital infrastructure, classroom technology, as well as investments in AI infrastructure, STEM education, and workforce development. Focusing on coordination would maximize the return on those existing investments while supporting Ontario's broader goals of innovation, economic growth, and workforce readiness. This approach introduces change in phases, allowing Ontario to build system resources over time rather than requiring immediate, abrupt, large-scale reform. Phase 1 focuses on coordination and establishes the public foundation. The ministry publishes a provincial AI literacy framework with a clear definition and core competencies. It also launches a centralized resource hub with curriculum connections, teaching resources, and guidance on academic integrity and privacy, which is continuously updated as AI evolves. At this stage, the ministry also releases a public roadmap outlining deliverables, timelines, and expectations for future phases, providing clear direction to school boards and educators. This phase builds on existing ministry structures and capacity to coordinate system-wide initiatives and fund professional development, making implementation feasible without creating new systems. Next, the ministry introduces minimum student entitlement by grade level, ensuring that every student completes 1 to 2 structured AI literacy activities per grade. These activities focus on core competencies, including understanding how AI works, evaluating outputs for bias and misinformation, using AI responsibly and safely, and applying academic and integrity expectations. To support this, the ministry provides sample activities, lesson templates, and assessment examples through the resource hub. This ensures consistent expectations while still allowing flexibility with implementation across school boards. This phase is introduced through updated ministry guidance and a dedicated implementation package outlining expectations, timelines, and available supports. To operationalize this, the ministry requires school boards to submit public implementation plans and supports professional learning through existing systems such as resources on digital platforms, professional development days, and board-level instructional leads. The ministry also introduces monitoring and reporting metrics at this phase, including student participation rates, board implementation progress, and educator training uptake. This phase also leverages existing budget 2026 investments, including $95 million to support digital learning and $66 million through the Classroom Supplies Fund, which provides approximately $750 per teacher to support the integration of AI literacy resources. Finally, the ministry embeds AI literacy into existing curriculum expectations across relevant subjects such as languages, science, civics, and careers. This ensures consistent system-wide outcomes while avoiding the creation of a standalone course, which would isolate AI literacy and add pressure to an already busy timetable. It also allows up-to-date content to evolve through the resource hub rather than requiring frequent curriculum overhauls. This approach requires sustained coordination over time, creating a risk that later phases may be delayed. To mitigate this, each phase is tied to clear deliverables and supported by public progress reporting to ensure accountability. A second risk is the rapid evolution of AI, which may lead to outdated curriculum content. This is addressed by separating stable, foundational, long-term competencies embedded in the curriculum from evolving tools and examples delivered through the resource hub. Despite these addressed limitations, this remains the most feasible and realistic option. Because it is phased, progress can be made incrementally, and even partial implementation improves coordination and student exposure compared to the status quo. It is stronger than guidance-only approaches, which don't set requirements or ensure consistent outcomes, and more feasible than full immediate curriculum reform, which disrupts the current revision cycle and is more abrupt to implement seamlessly for the ministry. Importantly, Ontario's new curriculum review and revision guide, which now reviews subjects every few years, creates a perfect window of opportunity for this staged approach, allowing early phases to begin building coordination and consistency while the system works on aligning formal curriculum updates into natural review cycles. Ontario's challenge is not introducing AI into education, it's catching up to the reality that students are already using it without a system ensuring they understand it. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions or feedback.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mikaila. I'm going to invite your first reader, which is Mark, to respond.
Thank you, Mikaila. That was awesome. And I mean, with all of these, but including this one, these are very timely topics. I mean, this is a real live issue in our society and our governments, and for educators and for students. Can you go back to your 3 phases so I can look at them while we're talking? So, I mean, certainly, I think this is a critical. Yeah, that one. That's great. A critical thing to tackle for all the reasons that you said and I just said. People are feeling it, and I guess there's a question, and maybe if there is a longer paper for the Capstone project, I think, to dig into, of like where you've seen this kind of phasing be successful in the past or not, as other topics have emerged. I think Ontario has had a real push in the 70s and 80s around media literacy, which I think at the time were, people had similar kind of concerns. How do we deal with just the growing electronic media and the fact that our school system isn't really prepare kids to navigate that, and that we're kind of stuck just thinking about books and much older media. And similarly, I think a lot of what led to especially the computer parts of STEM education over the last 20 years were driven by kind of a similar feeling to this. Like, we're falling behind in core critical, historical things like maths and sciences, but also computer science and computational thinking and all those things. So I would really encourage you to kind of go back and look at what did and didn't work in those processes of governments metabolizing those changes into, and maybe you did, so maybe it's a question. Did you go back and look at some of those as you were preparing this?
Yeah. Like, are you talking about the entire, like, the structured phased approach and how that
Well, I'm talking about the
works,
history of successful and unsuccessful integration of new technologies into our core curriculum as a province or as a society. Like, what techniques have worked in the past and what haven't? Because I think this is the thing you're talking about. I should say out loud. I had a lot of experience in the kind of STEM digital literacy experience. Zilla worked on that for about 10 years and met a lot of educators in a lot of jurisdictions. And the thing you're talking about is really hard. So that's why I'm wondering if, where you've looked at successful and unsuccessful tactics in the past.
Yeah. I think that's super important to consider. You keep mentioning digital literacy, which is something I kept coming across when looking into the curriculum. And that's something that the government is starting to integrate into curriculum. But I think looking at that, understanding that it's, and aligning it with AI, like understanding that it's a big idea and kind of breaking it up into phases would be most feasible. Just direct integration into the curriculum is super abrupt, and it's heavy on the education system to implement. So a staged approach is a little bit more feasible for all stakeholders, the education system, as well as educators and students and parents, everyone that's involved in the curriculum. So hopefully a staged approach would help introduce like a more introductory level to get people more familiarized with the concept and have it a little like like in phase 2, it's practiced. It begins practice into the classrooms, and then phase 3 is the full integration. So that was kind of my idea behind the phased approach.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I guess the only thing I would maybe leave you with as you're thinking about refining the phase approaches. I would not treat that embedding in core subjects as a phase 3 item, but as a design principle that I would put across all of your all of your different phases. I mean, right now, AI is already embedded in English and already embedded in math and already embedded in science. It's just that the school system doesn't have any influence over that. It doesn't prepare people. And people are using these tools, as you said, in those subjects. And so I think you have to kind of treat that embedding as a thing to solve for, I would say, at each step, whether it's guidance or other things. And that historically, I think, has been one of the things that has emerged. Like one of the things you can go look at is the whole movement around 21st century skills, which was a kind of subset of STEM. And it was embedding the kind of computational and digital thinking skills into music, into the arts, into all those things, which did both produce better learning outcomes and made it easier because you didn't have to come up with new funding and so on. So I would just take that embedded in core subjects and look at how you might weave it across all of your different phases as you come up with your final plan.
Okay, thank you. That's really good feedback. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Mikaila. As I queue up our next presenter, I would just note that Mark set a precedent, which our other judges may or may not wish to take up, which is to include some comments when you're not a reader on a presentation in the meeting chat. We'll make sure that those comments are available to all the presenters, and we'll make sure that they're also forwarded on to individual presenters. So if you feel so inclined, judges, by all means, feel free to put any thoughts that you were not able to cover in this discussion in the chat. With that said, I'm going to move us onward and invite Kristelle to present. Sorry, Kristelle, I'm just getting you queued up here. I'm going to give you control of the presentation, and hopefully, yes, I see you there. So it seems to be working.
Okay,
All
perfect.
right.
All right, thank you, Cliff. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me today on my capstone presentation. Sorry, it's not working.
My apologies. If you try to use your right cursor key, your right arrow on your keyboard, hopefully it will advance. Oh, not on your mouse, but on your.
Sorry.
No worries. There, you got it.
Oh, perfect. Thank you so much. Okay.
No problem.
So Indigenous data sovereignty, by definition, is the ability for Indigenous peoples, communities, and nations to participate, steward, and control data that is created with or about themselves. It deals with Indigenous traditional knowledge and cultural legacy being misused, appropriated, and stolen. Beginning with key terms, Indigenous peoples' inherent and inalienable rights are upheld by UNDRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The acronyms for complementing data governance principles that direct the management and sharing of data are OCAP, CARE, and FAIR. OCAP stands for First Nations rights to own, control, access, and possess their data. CARE stands for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethical use first. FAIR stands for findable, accessible, and interoperable and reusable data. So the policy problem here lies in the implementation gap. OCAP, CARE, and other Indigenous data governance principles are widely accepted as standards, but federal and provincial programs frequently fail to operationalize them in the real data systems, contracts, and policies. Because of this implementation gap, information about First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people is often gathered, linked, and maintained under Crown-centric legal and administrative frameworks rather than Indigenous laws and decision-making authorities. As a result, Indigenous people continue to be at danger of data misuse, exploitation, and a limited ability to influence how data informs decisions that significantly impact their rights and well-being. Looking at policy objectives, I've identified 4 concrete targets. So objective 1 is to strengthen Indigenous autonomy over decisions about public data. Objective 2 is to make OCAP and CARE the standard for governance and priority programs. Objective 3 is to embed Indigenous data governance within foundational legal frameworks. And Objective 4 is to reduce documented instances of Indigenous data misuse and extractivism. Option 1 is continuing with the status quo, which gradually sees incremental compliance. This option relies on small program-by-program changes while preserving the current Crown-centric legal and institutional framework. This approach puts short-term viability, legal risk management, and administrative continuity ahead of structural change. A main concern is that as data connectivity and AI grows, the implementation gap will either remain the same or get worse. Governments face increasing legitimacy and reconciliation risks if symbolic commitments are not accompanied by structural reform and Indigenous power over data is still limited. Additionally, it runs the danger of locking in digital infrastructures that are challenging to later refit. Option 2 is a risk reduction and accountability-focused approach. This approach places a higher priority on minimizing abuse and extractivism through Indigenous-led oversight and accountability. To keep an eye on government-funded and government-run data initiatives containing Indigenous-related data, governments can set up Indigenous-mandated oversight mechanisms such as complaints/redress systems, joint audit units, and Indigenous data protection agencies. The focus is on oversight rather than redistributing decision rights or amending laws. So while certain injustices can be avoided or fixed, underlying power disparities would still exist. Option 3 is a complete legal and institutional realignment approach. Here, governments would pledge to amend key federal statutes, such as the Privacy Act, Access to Information Act, or Statistics Act, as well as at least one significant provincial or territorial privacy or health information statute per jurisdiction. With statutory mandates to exercise joint responsibility and supervise implementation, new or reinforced Indigenous Crown data governance organizations would be established. Instead of negotiating separately, program-level OCAP/CARE agreements would be in line with the current legislative framework. Here, durability and structural clarity are given precedence over speed. Time, political viability, and intricacy would be the primary trade-offs. Instead of emphasizing program-specific agreements, this option views information, legislation, and institutional mandates as the main levers. It differs structurally from plans that function inside current statutes since it rewrites the fundamental guidelines for all upcoming endeavors. Lastly, option 4 is program-level governance reform. Whilst this approach has no immediate legal changes, here, governments demand OCAP/CARE consistent governance in new or significantly updated programs that create or largely rely on Indigenous-related data in health, education, social services, and justice through program design and financing levers. Indigenous ownership/control provisions, Indigenous consent for designated secondary uses, and access terms established in collaboration with Indigenous partners must all be included in program terms and authority. To provide Indigenous institutions with shared responsibility over important decisions, co-governance committees would be established in at least 3 major sectors in each jurisdiction. This solution is unique in that it purposefully delays legislative change while pushing program levers as far as feasible. It is a governance-first strategy that offers a middle-of-the-road route between complete legal change and the status quo by testing and scaling Indigenous Crown co-governance inside current legal frameworks. So what is my policy recommendation? So to close the implementation gap for Indigenous data governance, I would advise that governments execute a program-level governance reform strategy. The key trade-off here is between short-term viability and structural ambition. In the current setting, this approach implicitly prioritizes realistic changes in authority and standards in priority areas over urgent system-wide statutory change. The limitations noted, limited legislative windows, fragmented jurisdiction, and pressing concerns from growing data linking and AI are reflected in that weighting. Under practical limitations, program-level governance reform significantly advances 3 of the 4 objectives while setting the stage to achieve the final objective, the integration of Indigenous data governance into fundamental legal frameworks. Program-level governance reform has potential risks of fragmentation, unequal intra-Indigenous representation, and legal vulnerabilities. The analysis done offers solutions to diminish these risks, including pairing reforms with specific criteria for Indigenous partners' representation and capacity building, as well as centralized guidelines and common sector-specific templates. Instead of viewing program-level governance reform as an end state, it is best positioned as a first step that produces tangible models and evidence to support further legal and institutional realignment. For these reasons, recommending program-level governance reform as the primary strategy and explicitly acknowledging that legal and institutional realignment should follow in subsequent phases is a rational, cohesive, and analytically supported policy decision. Indigenous data sovereignty is not simply a technical issue or an administrative challenge. It is a question of power, of relationship, and of rights. Throughout this presentation, I've shown that what Canada lacks is implementation, and that gap is not neutral. It produces real harms: extractive research, misrepresentation, and the continued reproduction of colonial power in digital systems. In the end, data is not abstract. It influences narratives, funding, services, and policy. Indigenous peoples have no control over the narratives that are told about them or the decisions that are made about them because they lack control over their data. However, relationships based on reciprocity, respect, and self-determination can be established when Indigenous governance is integrated into the systems that generate, handle, and utilize data. Closing the implementation gap is a component of creating a future in which Indigenous nations have the power to safeguard their own communities, choose their own priorities, and manage their own knowledge. That is why Indigenous data sovereignty matters, and that is why the path forward must begin with meaningful, enforceable, and Indigenous-led governance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kristelle. Right on time. And I will invite Graham to be the first reader and respondent to your presentation.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the presentation. Really timely and important issue. Yeah, I mean, I really like the design of the presentation. You know, laid it out really clearly. I had a couple of questions, and one largely for my own edification. What is the origin of the OCAP and CARE framework? Because I noticed in a few instances it had like the little registered trademark sign next to it. So who developed that? And yeah, just if just quickly answer that.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So they were actually, so I'm just finding it in my notes. If you could give me 1 second so I make sure I
No
tell
worries.
you the accurate. So they are actually Indigenous-centered frameworks by the First Nation Info FIGNC. And they were grounded in sovereignty, collective benefit, and authority. So FAIR is more so a technical framework focused on data usability, but OCAP and CARE, they're registered by Indigenous organizations.
Very interesting. Cool. Yeah. I mean, I really like, you know, the idea of taking, you know, sort of one option as a bridge to a, you know, potentially more complicated and longer term option. I mean, I think that's always a good strategy when you're dealing with something this broad and complex. The downside is that, or potential downside anyway, is that you know, you're creating, you know, particularly if you're creating co-governance structures across these programs, and it's not just like they're programs, but they're also whole sectors of government activity. Like you highlighted education and you know, healthcare as being, and I mean those immensely complex data environments that like cut across multiple jurisdictions and things like that. So so you know, by creating those co-governance, I think it's a great idea, but you're sort of creating structures in the interim that will have weight and administrative capacity So that's all going to get built up. And I guess my question would be, as you move towards that desired end state of deeper, legal and regulatory change, how do you prevent that interim from becoming a complicating factor in developing that kind of desired final end state? Because now you've got this whole structure that may not be what you want for your final end state. So, how do you manage those kinds of transitions? Because people get invested in those structures.
Yeah, I think I felt that the framework kind of requires like a co-development of representation protocols within each nation. So in terms of like preventing fragmentation or one Indigenous group having more representation than another. I also think that a lot of the tools, such as like funding agreements, they're implemented in a way where it's reassessed on like an annual or 3 to 5 year basis. So I think by having those checkpoints in place, we're able to reassess, reevaluate what's working, what's not working, and move from there. So I think like funding agreements, one of the easily implemented tools that I mentioned, that is a very good checkpoint to assess where we're at and how much we're progressing before or on the road to complete institutional and legislative realignment.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kristelle. Thank you, Graham. We are going to now shift to our next speaker. And so I will invite Samantha to take the spotlight and take control of the deck. And you should be able to cursor forward and backwards through the slides now, Samantha, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Cliff. Good afternoon, everyone. This presentation asks whether Canada's commitment to responsible AI governance holds up in the most consequential domains in which the government operates, immigration. Just trying the slides. Oh, perfect. Okay, so Canada is positioning itself as a leader in responsible AI governance. There is a federal AI register, an algorithmic impact assessment tool, and as of February 2026, a dedicated AI strategy for the federal public service. Yet in immigration, automated systems are influencing decisions that can result in detention, denied entry, or deportation without independent verification that those systems have been tested for demographic performance gaps and biases. This gap between Canada's stated commitment to responsible AI governance and its operational practice is what this analysis hopes to address. So at Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenships Canada, which I will refer to as IRCC, Chinook has processed applications since 2018. It flags applications using past case risk indicators, pre-populates refusal reasons, and deletes officers' review notes. Because IRCC classifies Chinook as a processing aid, not as an automated decision-making system, no algorithmic impact assessment was conducted pre-deployment. The House of Commons Standing Committee investigated and made 6 recommendations, including that IRCC conduct a proper algorithmic impact assessment and an independent race equity review. At the Canada Border Services Agency, which I will refer to as CBSA, 2 facial recognition systems are in operation. The first is primary inspection kiosks, also called PICs. At airports, they use facial verification to check traveler identities before they reach a border officer. While Report In, CBSA's mobile app, captures biometric facial data and location from individuals under active immigration monitoring. Consent is formally required, but the alternative is attending a CBSA office in person, which significantly limits how truly voluntarily this consent is. So this is not a theoretical concern. In 2021, IRCC refused 72% of applications from Francophone African countries compared to 35% from all other regions, a disparity that was traced back to Chinook. When called before parliamentary committees, IRCC's defense was that Chinook was not AI and therefore fell outside oversight requirements.
Federal courts have disagreed, finding in multiple cases that AI input shaped Chinnock's decision regardless of how IRCC classifies the tool. Sorry. A 2019 study from the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology found false positive error rates for Black and Asian individuals are 10 to 100 times higher than for white individuals, a result of training data sets that underrepresent darker-skinned faces. Both PICs and the report and app rely on algorithms that from this same category trained on datasets that produce these same disparate performance gaps. When these systems misidentify, the consequences are wrongful detention, denied entry, and deportation, falling on those least positioned to challenge them. So how should Canada govern these systems before they cause irreversible harm? To address this problem, we need policies that achieve 4 things. First, reduce instances of discriminatory misidentification in IRCC and CBSA processes before they occur. Second, build trust, especially among racialized communities who bear disproportionate risk and have limited visibility into how these systems function. Third, improve coordination between IRCC and CBSA, which operate under different ministers with no shared standards for how Chinook, PICs, and the report and app are governed. Fourth, close the enforcement gap by establishing an independent oversight entity with the authority to prevent the deployment of systems with unverified demographic performance gaps. One constraint that shapes all 4 objectives is that both agencies face pressure to reduce processing times, but this cannot substitute for accountability. So based on these objectives, I will evaluate 4 policy options. The first option is the status quo. So agencies self-conduct the Treasury Board's 65-question algorithmic impact assessment before deploying automated systems. There is no independent verification, no mandated publication timeline for results, and the Treasury Board cannot halt a non-compliant deployment. This option preserves operational continuity, and agencies avoid compliance costs and deployment delays. Against all 4 objectives, it fails each one. Systems with unverified demographic performance gaps remain deployable without external scrutiny. The public has no access to performance data, and fragmentation between IRCC and CBSA persists. The status quo is a deliberate choice to accept existing conditions or constraints rather than address them. Option 2 requires the Privacy Commissioner to independently verify the algorithmic impact assessment before any AI or FRT system is deployed by both agencies. The Commissioner can mandate bias testing on diverse datasets, withhold approval from non-compliant systems, and require algorithmic impact assessment results to be published before deployment. To do this meaningfully, the Commissioner needs 2 categories of capacity: algorithmic auditing specialists to evaluate training data for demographic representation, and GBA Plus analysts to disaggregate error rates by race, gender, and age. This capacity should ideally be built through in-house specialists within the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. This directly advances objectives 1 and 4 by preventing discriminatory deployment before harm occurs and establishing an independent actor with real enforcement authority. However, the primary trade-off is deployment speed, and the critical implementation risk is the Commissioner lacking adequate resources or legislative authority, which could ultimately make this verification performative. This risk must be addressed as a condition of implementation rather than a reason to reject this option. Oh, there we go. Option 3 maintains agency self-assessment, but adds mandatory transparency and individual rights. Agencies publish algorithmic impact assessment results with demographic error rates. Individuals are notified when automated systems have influenced a decision about their case, and appeal mechanisms are established before permanent enforcement actions such as deportation are taken. This builds legitimacy through visibility, advancing objective 2. The main limitation is that this approach is retrospective. It does not prevent discriminatory systems from being deployed. Rather, it makes their effects visible after the harm has already occurred. Critically, accountability is displaced onto individuals already navigating a complex, high-stakes system with limited resources, and they may already be facing language barriers and significant power asymmetry with the government. And even when they do challenge a decision, no mechanism compels agencies to fix the underlying discriminatory pattern. Transparency matters, but on its own, it's not prevention. Option 4 establishes a joint IRCC-CBSA governance committee with unified algorithmic impact assessment standards, shared bias testing thresholds, and coordinated pre-deployment reviews. Neither agency may deploy a system that the other has addressed as non-compliant. This advances Objective 3. However, 2 structural constraints limit this option. Both agencies remain self-assessing. If both accept a bias system is compliant, deployment proceeds without any independent check. And the framework has no structural durability. It depends on sustained agreement against 2 ministerial portfolios, so a change in government priorities could dissolve this arrangement entirely. Coordination addresses fragmentation, but does not necessarily close the enforcement gap. Based on this analysis, the recommendation is option 2, independent pre-deployment verification by the Privacy Commissioner with the authority to withhold approval from non-compliant systems. This is the only option that prevents deployment of systems with unverified demographic performance gaps before harm occurs, advancing Objective 1. And it is the only option that closes the enforcement gap by creating an independent actor with no institutional authority, advancing Objective 4. These are the 2 most critical objectives, because currently systems trained on unverified datasets are being deployed without an external check. There are 2 significant trade-offs, however. The first is that this option prioritizes equity over efficiency. It slows deployment, but efficiency gained through a system producing disparate outcomes is not a real benefit. The downstream costs could include litigation, public backlash, and the erosion of public trust in institutions. And these may outweigh any efficiency gain. The second trade-off is structural protection before individual empowerment. Transparency mechanisms belong as implementation conditions alongside this option, but not as a substitute for it. One implementation condition is non-negotiable. The Privacy Commissioner must be properly resourced with algorithmic auditing specialists and GVA Plus analysts, and given real legislative authority through a Privacy Act amendment. Without that, this recommendation risks becoming the same kind of performative process it is designed to replace. Ultimately, Canada's credibility as a leader in responsible governance requires that these systems be verified before they are used to make life-altering decisions. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take any feedback or questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Samantha. I'm going to invite your first reader, Manon, to join the conversation. You are spotlighted, Manon.
Thank you. Very good presentation. I really liked your problem definition at the beginning. Like you got me from the start. Like, oh, yeah, like with those big numbers, and you're like, we need to do something here. There's a problem. So I think like very, very well done on that part. I have a question on your recommended option. I'm curious as to why you chose the Privacy Commissioner. So I'm taking a bit of a machinery of government kind of of like looking at mandates, and so why you chose the Privacy Commissioner as the sort of best place to ensure the compliance with this tool. Like I'm trying to think, like, obviously there's always the option of creating new kind of commissioners and kind of other enforcers, but there's also maybe like tools like the Canadian Human Rights Commission, because it seems to be more of a non-discrimination kind of aspect that we're trying to get to rather than the privacy issue. Or I mean, there's the Auditor General, but they're always sort of after the fact. So I'm curious why you sort of went the privacy route as the potential enforcer of this new mechanism.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I came across as while I was doing my research and analysis was that the Privacy Commissioner has done investigations on like CBSA. I think there was an instance where there was an unauthorized use of biometric data. And so there's kind of already that like precedence of investigating these processes and making sure that they are protecting people's privacy, but also their human rights. And I really did sort of think about the idea of maybe it would become its own commissioner as we roll out more automated systems and AI systems. So maybe in the future there will be their own AI commissioner. But yeah, and it also kind of exists sort of, it reports to the parliament, so it kind of exists structurally independent, which I think is important for this to be very like effective. Yeah, I think that's kind of, oh, and my last point is, sorry, It wouldn't, so the fourth option with like interagency coordination, that kind of has like the political sort of aspect where if there is a change in government, there might be priorities that are shifted. But if it's the privacy commissioner, then that would kind of outlast that and maybe maintain those standards and maintain those priorities. Yeah. I hope that answered the question.
No, it's a good one. I don't
Yeah.
think there's an obvious response, so I think it can go in
Yeah.
so many different ways. Like one
Yeah,
could argue maybe the parliamentary budget officers has something to say about that, because those are huge sort of investments as well. So there's different kind of argument that we can make and sort of make it fit in different places. So thank you for that.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Manan. Thank you, Samantha. I'm going to take back the control here and invite our next speaker, who is Gurvir, to take the spotlight. And Gurvir, I'm going to give you control of the deck. You should now be able to advance slides. Perfect. Take it away.
So I'll be focusing on political deepfakes. So let's start with the question. In the age of AI, seeing is no longer believing. How do we protect truth in our democracy and society? So nearly 60% of Canadians aged 18 to 34 encounter deceptive content daily or weekly. So while misinformation is not new, advances in AI had made it significantly more dangerous. And in the past, it was easier to comprehend if the information was real or not, and this content spread slower. Today, AI has allowed individuals to create more realistic content, such as fake political images or videos of politicians committing acts that they might even do, content that is harder to identify and can be produced at a scale. For example, there's a video circulating on TikTok where Prime Minister Mark Carney, as you see on the slide, stated on Canadian vehicle regulations that all vehicles manufactured before 2000 will be gradually phased off Canadian roads. This video became viral and led to a lot of people believing it's real. This type of deepfakes shown in the example are increasingly spreading, and deepfakes are becoming more persuasive and difficult to verify. Most importantly, this issue is troubling during the election period. Deepfakes can influence public perception before election, shape voter decision-making during campaigns, and spread misinformation even after results are announced. While at the same time, problems the issue is troubling during the problems preferring engagement over truth makes it harder to solve this problem, and making deepfakes spread before the content is verified and fake and taken down is harder. Therefore, deepfakes have been a risk to public trust, democratic institutions, and digital information landscapes. Given these growing risks that deepfakes pose to democracy and public trust, it's important to pose clear policy objectives to guide an effective response. So we need a successive policy to address 4 objectives. Increase the ability of individuals to identify AI-generated and manipulated content through enhanced transparency, restrict, punish malicious creation and misuse of AI technology, limit the spread of deceptive deepfake content, and 4th, safeguard freedom of expression and democratic participation while addressing the impact of deepfakes. So policy option 1 is the status quo, where it's mostly about platform regulation and existing legal frameworks. So currently, deepfakes are partially addressed by existing legal frameworks relating to fraud, defamation, and non-consensual imagery, along with platform policies and limited public warnings. Yet, the enforcement is uncoordinated and reactive. Platforms create their own policies in identifying and managing deepfakes or AI-generated content, and act on harmful content when they're already spread. Therefore, this approach advances in minimal transparency surrounding AI-generated content and is not effective in reducing the misuse or spread of deepfakes. The key trade-off here is that maintaining how everything is right now with the current system does not require new laws or systems, and it's not exposed to constitutional challenges like the freedom of expression. Yet, this option cannot respond to limiting the spread of political deepfakes and sustaining trust in information. And therefore, it does not meet any objectives. Policy option 1 addresses strengthening public campaigns and media literacy. It strengthens the public education and media literacy to assist individuals in effectively identifying and assessing deepfake content. This includes implementing media literacy into education systems, along with providing journalists and civil society with tools and delivering targeted public awareness initiatives during election periods. This approach advances Objective 1 of improving individuals' ability to identify AI-generated content, but also advances Objective 4 of democratic participation by creating more informed decision-making individuals. The trade-off here is that it's less restrictive on content, protects freedom of expression, but it does not lead to eliminating the creation or spread of deepfakes. As individuals might be more aware, harmful content can still spread widely and quickly. Policy option 3, mandatory platform disclosure and provenance framework. This policy option focuses on enhancing transparency through mandatory disclosure and provenance systems. This will require platforms to make AI-generated content more identifiable by having measures such as labeling manipulated content and using technical standards to strengthen how content is verified and track the source of where it was created. It allows individuals to identify and better understand the content they engage with. The approach aims to advance Objective 1 by allowing individuals to easily recognize deepfakes and be able to comprehend the information they are interacting with. Therefore, it supports transparency and advances Objective 4 by creating more democratic participation and informed decision-making. The trade-off here is that this policy option enhances transparency without any restriction of the speech, but it does not limit the creation or spread of deepfakes. Even if the content is labeled, deepfakes can still spread, and some users might ignore the label or engage with it. Policy option 4 is legal deterrence and harm reduction. This policy option aims to strengthen responses from legal frameworks to better address the harmful uses of deepfakes. Instead of focusing on awareness or transparency, this option addresses the misuse of AI technology by clarifying rules and consequences of existing legal frameworks like the Criminal Code or Election Act. This policy option targets misuse of technology and the creation of deepfakes that lead to impersonation, deception, or other types of misuse through better enforcement and legal mechanisms. This option advances Objective 2 in restricting and punishing malicious use of AI, publishing defined consequences, and promoting democratic participation and maintaining trust without any restriction on speech. The trade-off here is that it enhances accountability, but the approach is too reactive as the owner responds when the damages are done, and legal processes themselves take a long time and cannot tackle deepfakes in real time, and action is fast and it's playing catch-up. Policy option 5 would be the enhanced platform accountability model. This aims for enhancing platform accountability by mandating platforms to play a role in governing deepfake content. So rather than focusing on users, platforms are required to detect and label AI-generated content and remove any harmful deepfakes within a certain time frame. This option advances Objective 1 in identifying and limiting the spread of harmful deepfakes by aiming for faster identification and removal. Also, it advances Objective 4 slightly in restricting the misuse through accountability by placing responsibility on platforms to manage harmful content instead of allowing it to exist on their social media platforms. The trade-off here is that this option helps control the spread of deepfakes, but there's a risk of over-removal. So platforms might remove content that they consider aggressive or harmful to prevent facing penalties, but it will violate the freedom of expression. Also, it does not discourage the creation of deepfakes. It doesn't let me go next.
I'll advance it on my end. I'm not sure why. There you go.
So based on analysis, I would recommend enhanced platform accountability as the preferred policy option. I chose this approach because it advances 3 objectives, as it allows individuals to identify AI-generated content, and through the identification and labeling of deepfakes. It can also limit the spread of harmful deepfakes by removing them on time before it influences the individual, which addresses the scale and speed of deepfakes that they spread across platforms. Along with this, it proposes some level of accountability by imposing platforms to act, but the drawback is that it does not restrict individuals from creating deepfakes. So the approach does have trade-offs, especially when it comes to the fast removal of content. And it can lead to over-removal of the content, leading to a violation of freedom of expression. But this trade-off is more reasonable compared to other policy options because it focuses on the main risk, which is the fast spread of harmful deepfakes, and this option emphasizes addressing deepfakes in real time. In comparison to other policy options that are dependent on education, transparency, or legal processes that take a long time, this model focuses on more on an instant and an actionable approach. In conclusion, the strategy takes a more practical and balanced approach as it focuses on the realities of deepfakes, on how fast they can spread, while still acknowledging that the impact they are to risks to freedom of expression. And next slide, please. Thank you, and I look forward to your question and feedback.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Sorry for the technical difficulties there, but well handled. I'm going to invite Mark. Mark and Manon certainly have both dealt with this issue in different capacities, so I look forward to Mark, I look forward to your feedback. How about you're muted still?
Maybe just thank you, Cliff, and Gurvir, if we maybe go back to the recommendation slide just so we have it up while we're talking. Yeah, I mean, certainly this has become a bigger and bigger topic with misinformation and you know what's going on right now in terms of the amount of misinformation about the war that's going on, what's going on coming out of different governments. I mean, it's astounding. I don't think we ever could have seen you know, not just political impersonation, but impersonation by political figures of reality. So, but I think that your recommendation covers a lot of that. It doesn't just look at political impersonation and deep fakes. So I appreciate the breadth of the recommendations. And, you know, I agree, certainly you're going to kind of have the most impact if you can get the platforms to do something. And I guess the question is, whether you saw cases where other jurisdictions had been successful at that, you know, maybe Europe with the Digital Services Act and their whole kind of regulation of large platforms has some clues in there, although it doesn't quite get to the misinformation piece of it. But I think this is really, this type of platform accountability regulation has been something that really even the governments that have run at it, and even before you get to deepfakes, have really struggled to do effectively. So I wonder about how you balance maybe going at this ambitious version of it with maybe your second option of public education and digital literacy, which you might be able to make some progress on faster than this. And then I guess the other thing I would wonder, and this is always a question and things like this in this class and then in reality or in this program and in reality in Canada, is how you would think about this in the context of Canada being an incredibly tiny market for these companies. I mean, we saw with what happened in terms of regulation of news and Canadian government trying to get the platforms to compensate news organizations in Canada using the Australia as a model, that you had different platforms respond in different ways, including Facebook basically deplatforming the news industry in Canada. And so I wonder, you know, how you would think about getting this to work when we're such a small market, or if you would recommend coordinating with other, you know, say European governments so that you came with a coordinated approach and effectively you had more negotiating leverage with the platforms. Because and to summarize, I think I worry about this being hard and slow, and so I would put the digital literacy one as a complement to this. And I think it would be very difficult to make it have teeth. I mean, the benefit of your recommendation, it has teeth, but the problem is we've not been successful in creating teeth because we're so small. And so you might need to kind of band together with some other governments that, you know, together you might have some teeth.
Yeah, for sure. When I was looking at recommendations, I looked at the European Union, who has introduced like an AI Act and Digital Service Act, which is like they require platforms to label AI generated content, even take responsibility for limiting harmful materials. So their framework mostly focuses on transparency as well, and detection and platform responsibility. So I guess, you know, a very concrete thing when you look at them
would you recommend just mirroring what they've done to increase our negotiating power, or would you do something slightly different than them?
So like follow their approach.
Yeah.
I might actually let you mull on that question. Gurvir is probably the best strategy. It's an excellent question to, as you take these next 2 weeks, to take on the feedback from the judges and think about your final report. I think that's an excellent question to motivate your thinking as you round out your report. And maybe I feel like I'd be remiss not to just briefly tap Manon on the shoulder, given that she is the director of the Protecting Democracy unit at the PCO, to ask Manon if you have any other sort of comments that you might want to add to this discussion.
Thank you. It was hard to stay here and not say anything. This is like, so I was writing you a little note with some links to some information, but anyway, super interesting subject, obviously like highly complex and subject. So one way to sort of approach it is to try to figure what policy tool you're going to use to sort of advance that objective. So if you're trying to, for example, and I'll send you the information, like last week our minister introduced amendments to the Elections Act that addresses deepfake. So it's very targeted, very like focused on election period, as if you're taking the DSA approach and you're looking at platform governance more generally, more broadly. So there's different like policy tools that we sort of can use. So I think by being clearer on which kind of lane you're trying to address it, and you're gonna tell me this is so siloed and so Government of Canada way of thinking, agreed, but it's also helps advance policy proposals within the machine if you kind of know exactly where you sort of which lane you're taking, right?
Yes, yeah, I'll take that into consideration. Thank you for the feedback.
Yes, thank you, Manon. And I think that's sage advice. So, Gurvir, you have a lot of great thoughtful responses to chew on as you develop your final paper. And I will say thank you to our judges and to Gurvir, and we will get set up for our next presenter, which is Cole. Give me just one moment. All right, Cole, you are spotlighted, and I am going to share the deck with you, and hopefully it will work. Looks like it.
Perfect. Okay.
Great. Go ahead. It's all yours.
Okay, perfect. Well, hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. So in this presentation today, I will outline my strategic framework for modernizing Canada's digital service delivery infrastructure. This framework culminates in recommendations for DPS and for the newly established Office of Digital Transformation. In our digital world, public service delivery outcomes are increasingly affecting citizens. Over 92% of Canadians as of 2024 were digitally enabled. Thus, the establishment of the Office of Digital Transformation presents a key opportunity for systemic reform for Canada within the Canadian government. My goal is for the Canadian government to transition from a model of reactive sort of catch-up service delivery digitization to one of proactive and user digital services.
Cole, I might just jump in just to say that there's some microphone issues. I can make out what you're saying, but the microphone seems to go in and out.
Okay. How about now?
Let's see. Are you using the microphone on Teams sometimes picks another microphone than the one that you would normally use, but I think we can make it out. But I just wondered if you immediately saw that the microphone was set to.
if it's okay, Cliff, I suppose that I'll just try.
Yeah, you just do you have your headset by any chance?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's switch to that. And this won't count against your time, Cole.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, that's much better.
Much better.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, perfect. So I'll just then I'll go ahead again. So I'll say in this presentation, I am going to outline my strategic framework for modernizing Canada's digital service delivery infrastructure. This framework will culminate in recommendations for the Treasury Board Secretariat and for the newly established Office of Digital Transformation. So in our digital world, public service delivery outcomes are increasingly affecting citizen trust. Over 92% of Canadians as of 2024 were digitally enabled, and thus the establishment of the Office of Digital Transformation presents a key opportunity for systemic reform within the Canadian government. My goal is for our government to transition from a model of reactive sort of catch-up service delivery to one of proactive and user-centered digital service success. Okay. So Canada is currently falling in international digital government rankings. At the turn of the century, Canada was #1 in the world in e-government initiatives. With a number of the failed initiatives that you can see on the screen since then, the government of Canada has fallen, unfortunately, to 9th in the world. So the policy problem here is that this is directly leading to inequitable, costly, and difficult to access public services that are not currently meeting the needs of Canadians in the best way possible. Of course, the Canadian Federal Service is a multi-thousand person strong organization with a distinct culture, which draws from both Westminster-style government and established Canadian norms. And so this report analyzed dozens of articles, and it interviewed multiple government staff to try to take into account the unique social, legal, cultural, institutional, and political roadblocks that might come with modernizing Canada's service delivery. So these are some examples of the current state of poor service delivery from the government of Canada. And they directly point to a problem with the adoption of digital technologies in the Canadian government. Again, 92% of Canadians are now digitally enabled. So for the majority of Canada, digital service options are important. In 2025, only 63% of Canadians were satisfied with the state of Canada's digital services. Yes, so this proposal it aims to increase public service delivery capacity by facilitating these 5 objectives. I was working with 7 variables for policy analysis, or things could be changed, which were Treasury Board Secretariat procurement rules, departmental procurement authorities, service delivery standards, project financial monitoring practices, in-house talent composition, open sourcing, and changes to mobility policies, which include secondment. So those were some of the things that I figured could be changed. So for my option 1, it is implementing centralized financial monitoring together with TBS and the Digital Transformation Office. So this option represents a potential state where we could make each departmental transaction more public. There are studies to back up this strategy's effectiveness. More checks and balances for finances can be implemented, but critically, they need to lessen the administrative work for departments and not increase it. There may be less expenses that end up being approved. So that's a possible sort of roadblock. And we would have to teach modular procurement to all staff, which is a form of agile sort of workflow. Option 2 is staffing changes. So by changing the composition of staff, the Canadian government would immediately gain new digital skills. So that would be a huge benefit. And we could also change policies related to interdepartmental mobility. So that could help with having skills where they need to be in different places for different sort of projects. But some of the risks of the strategy include recreating the same problem. If specialists are hired and their specialist skills no longer apply in 10 years or 20 years in the future, then we are sort of left with the same problem. Newly hired staff may be less political aware, and they may need more training. And the public service is currently shrinking, not expanding. So hiring new staff doesn't necessarily align perfectly with what the public service is actually doing right now. Option 3 is standard setting and service design. So this would involve the dissemination of important user-centered design principles to all government employees. The Office of Digital Transformation would act as an informational node. And it would ensure that all government employees have knowledge of user-centered design and modular procurement. And for the Treasury Board, I would want to see self-reported spending checks made much less or eliminated. They currently make up a majority of the sort of spending checks right now. And so I'll head to the next slide. And so this was the final policy recommendation to implement centralized financial monitoring, to circulate user-centered design guidelines, and to set new procurement standards. For each option, I have a list of things that the Treasury Board would be required to do and that the Office of Digital Transformation would be required to do. But what is basically common among all these is the Office of Digital Transformation would act as a distributor of information and digital services, and the Treasury Board Secretariat would be the they would be the one to create sort of more financial checks and balances that don't sort of burden existing departments. So I will just leave this slide up for a second. I know there's a lot of text here. But that is pretty well my presentation. And yeah, thank you very much for listening. And I'm excited if you have any questions. I'll just bring it back to that last slide there. I don't know if I can.
Oh, sorry about that. I think I'm fighting you for the mouse to try to bring him in on. So
oh, yeah.
I apologize. I'm going to spotlight Manon and invite her to comment. And then Cole, where did you want your deck to be, on this slide, or you want it to be on the recommendation slide?
on the policy recommendation would be great.
Perfect. All right. Over to you, Manon.
Thank you, and thank you for choosing this subject, because like this could be, I'm sure, a little dry a little bit for people about the inner workings of the government, and I'm not quite sure where to take those comments, because like I feel like me talking about change management and the public service, I don't know if it's about a conversation I need to have at the pub or with my therapist, but it's it's a challenging one. But I think one thing to comment, I think that maybe you want to sort of think about and consider, and in terms of presenting things with respect to additional checks and balances. I'm not saying it's not necessary, but from my experience, there's if you had checks and balances, you need to take some out, right? It's about like not focusing on having new checks and balances, but rather focusing on streamlining the checks and balances so that you have a faster, more efficient, because I like that's what we're trying to get to, right? Having services that are delivered to Canadians on a much more timely kind of basis. So I think it's we saw that a lot in the context of regulations, like governments come in and saying like we're going to remove red tape. So it's like, so the policy that comes down in the department, if you want to create a new requirement for companies, for example, you need to take one out. Like it's one in, one out. Like you can't add a new layer of checks and balances. So I think that's one thing to consider. And I'm very curious about this idea of a centralized monitoring in relation to ministers' accountability to Parliament. So ministers are accountable for how they spend their money and how their departments function, right? So if this is being centralized in a separate kind of agency, are we still maintaining that kind of responsibility and accountability of the minister and those? And I guess the answer can be yes or no, depending on how it's structured, but it's maybe something to think about, like, because fundamentally our system is based on ministerial responsibility, and that means like ministers needs to be able to control what is done under their authority, right? So
yeah, no, definitely. Like it's a great critique. It speaks to the structural sort of realities of the government. And I would want there to be sort of user-centered design and modular procurement sort of requirements for the proposal. So I wouldn't necessarily be like advocating for like the Treasury Board to ever say no, you can't spend on this because you haven't like it's not like a digital enough project. But I would really want it to see just sort of have those principles like make sure that they've been considered. So, but that is a great thought, and it really speaks to the core of the issue. So so thank you.
Yeah. And maybe very quickly, if you want to send me your final report after, I have a colleague who just moved to the digital transformation office. I'm happy to sort of forward it to her for her information. And when I'm just being really picky. In one of your early slides, you mentioned like paper-based processes, and 2 of the example out of the 3 are actually provincial governments. So should you be presenting this to a federal official, they'd be like, well, that's not ours.
Yeah, true enough.
Wonderful. That's a very kind offer, Manon, and very poignant feedback. Thank you very much. Cole, thank you very much. Well done. And well done to all our presenters in the first half of the session. I will say that we kept to time and that we started about 4 or 5 minutes late because of me, but all our presenters and judges kept us to time. In order to ensure that we finish at 5 o'clock as promised, I would ask that we regroup at 3:15, so that gives a couple minutes for a quick break, top up your water, and we'll meet back here at 3:15. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll see you shortly. Erin, I'm just going to get you queued up while people return. I'll give you control of the screen and you can just confirm that you're able to adjust the slides. Great. All right, so how about we kick off?
Sorry, I was able to move the slide before, but now I'm having troubles for some reason.
My apologies. That may be. Give me just one moment and I will reshare, and sometimes that fixes the issue. Okay, I'm going to give you control again. That work? Can see my there. I see you. Yeah. How's that?
I think we're good.
Okay. If you run into trouble, we'll I'll adjust the slides for you.
Okay, sounds great. I find it's a bit glitchy when I bring my cursor back over it. It doesn't seem to catch up fully, so that might be.
I think if you just leave your cursor on the page, but use your arrow keys, you should be better.
Yeah, I see. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Cheers.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erin, and today I will be addressing AI-mediated sexual harm in Canada. So, AI-generated synthetic content refers to images or videos created using artificial intelligence, including deepfakes and other synthetic materials that can replicate a person's physical appearance, often without their knowledge or consent. Currently, it's estimated that 98% of all deepfakes are pornographic, and of that nature, 99% target women. While some may consent to their image being used explicitly, 96% of all pornographic deepfakes are considered non-consensual, suggesting that the majority of this content actively perpetuates gendered violence. As these technologies have expanded rapidly, they have outpaced the frameworks designed to regulate them, widening the gap between how harm is experienced and how institutions are able to respond. Unlike other forms of sexual violence, digital-based harms do not require direct contact between a perpetrator and a victim. They can be generated from existing images without a person's knowledge and then replicated and redistributed across platforms at a speed and scale that existing frameworks were not designed to govern. Legally, this is creating a gap. While Canadian criminal law prohibits the non-consensual distribution of intimate images, there is no specific section that directly addresses the creation of non-consensual synthetic sexual content unless it falls under the other offenses. Because there's no clear way to address these harms, it remains difficult to assign responsibility across creators, platforms, and users, further complicating how harms that disproportionately affect women are being recognized and managed within Canada. To evaluate any policy response, I've identified 4 objectives that both reflect the nature of the harm and the constraints on what our governments can realistically do. Let me see. Okay, my slide is not changing screen. Okay, perfect. The first objective is to reduce instances of non-consensual sexually explicit synthetic material targeting women in Canada. This would indicate whether or not a policy action is capable of limiting the creation or spread of harmful content. The second objective suggests that when harm occurs, responsibility can be clearly and consistently identified across cases. This targets a core challenge that comes with digital harm. Where accountability is often shared across actors, clarifying who is responsible for what harm can reduce potential uncertainties when responding to harm. The third objective would be to reduce harm without undermining legitimate and lawful uses of AI. Though this does not directly reduce harm, it would measure how well a policy would align with existing constitutional agreements like the right to freedom of expression. The fourth and last objective is to increase public awareness of consent and gendered harm in relation to AI-generated media. This can tell us to what extent people are aware of the problem and indicates whether or not a policy increases public knowledge. The first 2 objectives carry the most analytical weight in my evaluation. The core challenge in this policy area is not just that harm is occurring, it is that our frameworks make it very difficult to attribute responsibility when it does occur. Any option that could not address at least one of the two objectives fails to capture the most crucial aspects of AI sexual violence. With those criteria in place, I've evaluated 4 distinct policy approaches. There, okay. Option 1 is a victim-focused criminal law reform. So this first option amends the criminal code and the Canadian Victims' Bill of Rights to explicitly recognize AI-mediated sexual harm and builds directly on reforms already proposed under Bill C-16. It most strongly advances Objective 2 by clarifying responsibility. By formally recognizing these harms, it improves how law enforcement and courts interpret cases and assign accountability. It also supports harm reduction by encouraging reporting and reinforcing that these harms fall within established legal frameworks. However, this approach operates after harms occurred, meaning it does little to prevent the creation of harmful deepfakes. Its effectiveness also depends on consistent implementation across jurisdictions and institutions, which can vary amongst the provinces. Option 2 is an internationally coordinated governance framework. So because deepfake content is frequently created and circulated outside Canadian jurisdiction, the second option pursues coordinated governance through international partnerships. In this approach, Canada would align itself with allies through bodies like the OECD and G7 to clarify platform expectations, reporting standards, and enforcement of AI-mediated sexual violence. This approach advances objectives 1, 2, and 3. It targets the cross-border pathways through which harmful synthetic content spreads, improves clarity around the responsibility when actors are offshore, and avoids imposing heavy domestic restrictions on AI development. However, its biggest trade-off is its feasibility. So international coordination is slow, voluntary, and dependent on political alignment, and as a result may impact its implementation. Option 3 is a federal digital safety education and support team. This option establishes a specialized federal team focused on digital literacy, public education around AI-generated harm, and victim support to improve public understanding of consent in the context of synthetic media. It primarily advances Objective 4 by building awareness of consent in AI-related harm. It may also indirectly reduce harm by discouraging harmful behavior and improving reporting pathways. Since it does not restrict how people interact with AI programs, it also protects legitimate AI use. The core limitation of this, however, is that it lacks enforcement power. Education initiatives can shift norms over time, but they cannot close the institutional gap at the center of this problem. So option 4 is to make a regulatory amendments to platform oversight. This option introduces regulatory requirements for platforms operating in Canada that host or distribute user-generated content. It would introduce removal timelines and reporting systems for non-consensual synthetic content and would require platforms to produce reports regarding deepfake-related complaints and responses. It advances harm reduction by targeting how deepfakes are circulated at scale and strengthens responsibility by placing obligations on platforms to manage harmful content. It can also support awareness through clearer reporting systems and transparency requirements. However, this approach comes with significant trade-offs. It relies on imperfect detection technologies, involves complex implementation, and raises concerns around surveillance, privacy, and overreach. So based on this analysis, I recommend pursuing option 1, which is a victim-focused criminal law reform. And I would also include additional support from public awareness initiatives that strengthen understanding of consent and AI-mediated harm. The main reason for this is because focusing on legislative reforms most reliably advances the 2 objectives that are the most crucial in our current policy context. By placing a stronger emphasis on reducing harm and improving the ability to identify responsibility when harm does occur, this approach addresses the core gap between how harm is experienced and how institutions can respond. Compared to the alternatives, this option stands out as the most feasible because it does not depend on uncertain external conditions to determine success and can be implemented through Canada's existing legal and institutional frameworks. Platform regulation requires both reliable detection technology and consistent private sector compliance, but neither of these are guaranteed at the moment. international coordination requires sustained political alignment across multiple jurisdictions, and with increasing political tensions between allied countries, AI sexual violence may not be a top priority for global leaders. An education-based approach on its own can shift norms over time, but it still leaves the institutional gap unresolved. In contrast, though, a criminal law reform approach works within institutions that already exist and can be implemented through legislative processes that are well understood. While the trade-offs are significant compared to the other available options, a victim-focused criminal law reform supported by public awareness efforts should be recognized as the most feasible approach for addressing AI-mediated sexual harm in the current policy context. This recommendation does not solve every dimension of the problem, but it addresses the most immediate gap, being the disconnect between how harm is experienced and institutional responses. Thank you all, and I open the floor up to any questions.
Thank you very much, Erin. So Vas was slated as first reader for your presentation, so I'm going to add Graham to offer some initial thoughts and feedback.
Yeah, well, thanks for the presentation. Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's been an interesting number of presentations that deal with online harms, and certainly I think some of the things I really liked here, is actually moving to like a criminal sort of approach to the production, but I think that and it was also good to see that you sort of highlighted that there is an international dimension and that it's immensely difficult, but that like the responses do need to be coordinated across borders. I just wanted to clarify with you. So when your recommendation that you adopt, are you actually saying that you would criminalize the production of these kinds of deep fakes like as a criminal code offense, like distinct from other forms of sexual violence, but something that would be criminal in that sense?
So I mentioned Bill C-16 at the beginning of the option slide. It's not directly on it. Bill C-16 is in the process of, it's going through the House of Commons at the moment, so it's not fully in place, but it does actually address AI. So the distribution of AI generated intimate images or content or deepfake. So there is something potentially being added right now, but what I'm looking at is a little more focused on the victim side. So there would be amendments to the Victim Bill of Rights, which would fall back on the nature of coercion and the nature of how deepfakes, you don't necessarily need to be within contact with the person. So it would be more on the reactionary side of that. It wouldn't directly criminalize deepfakes because that's already being proposed at the moment. It would also add an element because, in Bill C-16, they're proposing the distribution of AI-generated content. I would also probably add that the creation with ill intent could be its own separate criminalized act. So yes, but more onto that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think the advantage of criminalizing both the creation and distribution of this kind of thing, and sensitive to the that there are free speech concerns in that, but we frequently draw that line that the indignity to the human person is sufficient to warrant an override of the what we would say is like a free speech approach. And personally, I think a criminalization like gives such a strong anchor to any subsequent conversation you have on platform governance or those kinds of things to sort of drive through those policy changes. Yeah, that's an interesting kind of thinking about the moral implications of that question and how we enact it through policy. But yeah, incredibly timely, really well done. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Erin. Manon, you are second reader. I don't know if you have any brief comments for Erin?
Not really, really well done. It's an issue I'm less sort of familiar with, and so it's interesting to see sort of the victim focused perspective that you're bringing to it. So I think that's, but I think like some of your comments in response to the question sort of helped clarify a few things. So maybe in terms of like in your reports, like really differentiating what's the criminalization versus what's the victim's bill right might be sort of helpful for clarity, because in answer to those questions that I sort of clicked for me. So that's good. Thanks.
That makes sense. Thank you very much.
Wonderful.
Cliff, can I just say one thing on
Absolutely.
this, just because I really liked, Erin, what you did, so I wanted to jump in and say, I mean, excellent, as everybody else has said, and I think just as it for this, but then for the others, what I appreciate is not only the choice of option one, because it's going to help the victims and it's the right thing to do, but also it's within the powers as Canada to focus on, you know, citizens who are in our country and the impact on them. And given the international nature of this problem, you've like tackled it from just a pure policy pragmatism of what can we do in our country in a global problem. And so I think that's a lens, you know, for everybody to take, right? It's very high impact, but it's also very pragmatic. I would say you might combine option two as well, and that I think when you get to this level of thing, like things like sex trafficking and other things, are just so charged, and everybody agrees that they're a problem, that international cooperation often will happen even when governments don't want to work together on other topics. And so your number one and two might be a interesting combination.
Yeah, I definitely agree. That would be something I would need to look into a little more detail of to see how that could be integrated, but I think that there's like strong grounds there. Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all our judges for their helpful contributions. Thank you to Erin for this presentation, and we will move forward with our next presenter, who is Sarah, in just a moment. I had Sarah, and then I lost her. Where did she go? There she is. All right. Sarah, you are spotlighted. We'll move to your deck. I will share the screen, and you should be ready to go.
All right, let's do a moment of truth test here, just to make sure that that will move when we expect it to. Right now, it's giving me the studio sound displays, which is not ideal here.
I'm sorry, that's me changing my volume.
Good, excellent, wonderful. Thanks, Cliff. All right, we seem to be working, and if not, I will be asking for some help. Thank you so much, everyone. I'll be leading a presentation exploring competitiveness in Canada. And of course, now that I've gone to click it, it doesn't want to click anymore. I'm sorry, Cliff, can I ask you to move that slide,
Absolutely.
please? Thank you so much.
My apologies.
No, it's all right. So we'll start by talking about the problem. Canada is experiencing what is known as an innovation paradox. Over the last 20 years, research and development spending has steadily decreased, and Canada's global competitiveness has fallen below those of most developed countries. The paradox describes the curious economic situation we find ourselves in. We have one of the most highly educated workforces in the world and consistently produce important research in both STEM and social sciences. And we've spent billions in public funds to improve the commercialization outcomes of that research through superclusters, innovation hubs, and special grants. And yet we still have not seen meaningful change in Canada's overall competitiveness. Existing market incentives have also failed to drive the changes needed. We don't see a lot of competitors in our key industries, and we don't see enough investment from the private sector into R&D. So this paradox points to an innovation policy challenge that's rooted in institutional coordination and incentive design. The problem remains, how can Canada increase R&D and become as competitive as its competitors? Cliff, I'll ask you to shift over to the next slide, please. Wonderful. So why do we care about global competitiveness? It is an important indicator of a country's productivity, economic growth, and a country's overall standard of living. I also think now more than ever, we're in a time where Canada is renegotiating its place on the world stage, and competitiveness attracts trade and talent and investment. Global competitiveness is measured annually by the World Bank, and the policy objectives listed here reflect some of the areas of competitiveness that Canada performs the weakest in relative to its size and development. The first objective is perhaps the most general and seeks to just bring Canada up to par with other countries over the next 5 years. And then the following are more specific and aligned to recommendations that have been consistently made by the World Bank over time. Objective 2 emphasizes engineering because this is where we are most likely to see research outputs that can generate intellectual property. Objective 3 focuses on IP output, which is the most significant indicator for global competitiveness. Objective 4 refers to capital expenses because research is expensive and often requires upfront costs and tools and infrastructure to conduct. And so this objective implies that R&D is more likely to occur if investments here increase. Finally, Objective 5 is to protect against real or perceived fraud and misuse of federal public expenditure on R&D programs.
Sorry.
No problem at all. Our first option here is to wait and see. This comic does a great job depicting what it feels like to be someone studying our innovation challenges, and I hope folks are able to read it, but if you're on a small screen, you might not be able to. And if not, that's okay. It's important to just recognize all of the inputs into a competitiveness challenge. You need ambitious firms and leaders, public spending, skilled labor, and a healthy competitive business environment. And there's no right answer. The real elephant in the room is that competitiveness can't just occur naturally, no more than these individuals can make that elephant sit down and participate in the finance meeting. The 2025 budget introduced key changes to 2 core R&D mechanisms, a defense industrial strategy, and multiple programs to support AI and quantum research. Waiting to see how these changes affect Canada's overall competitiveness is not a bad option, but I also think it could be combined with other activities. The next option that I looked at was introducing a patent box. Generally, this allows firms to pay a lower corporate income tax rate on profits generated from their IP assets, such as patents and sometimes other IP like designs or copyright. This strategy has been implemented in several OECD member states, including China and Australia and the UK. And there's evidence that countries with a patent box are more competitive. But I likely landed in the same place that ISED did when it requested feedback on it in 2024. This option feels like a lot of work, it's a lot of math, and it's a lot of risk. Determining what qualifies as IP income can be complicated, and it leads to administrative burdens for firms and the government, as well as the potential for more legal disputes. You'll see on this slide that this option is maybe able to move the needle on 3 of the objectives, while outright makes Objective 5 more difficult to achieve because of those risks. Option 3 refers to our IP village. To me, there was no better example of sort of weak institutional coordination than Canada's IP Village, which is a collection of 5 independent agencies running 10+ programs to support intellectual property initiatives. So this option was to overhaul Canada's federal IP initiatives, which would lead to the consolidation of that village into an island. To me, this strategy supports the policy objective of increasing the number of domestic patent filings because it improves the experience smaller firms have in trying to navigate the system, but also large firms as well. However, due to the scope of this option requiring collaboration of those 5 different agencies, it's likely to be time-consuming and expensive to evaluate each of those 10 programs and then recommend some sort of alternative. Making programs better and more efficient is not also guaranteed to increase the number of patents filed. I do think we need something like this, and this is a change that's necessary, but from a feasibility perspective, a shift like this felt like too much to propose in the current environment. Finally, we get to option 4. So this is regarding the scientific research and experimental development tax credit. In Budget 2025, this was described as the most important tool to drive innovation and is one of the programs I mentioned that has some changes. The most critical to our analysis is that firms are now able to claim their capital investments under SR&ED. Firms can recover 35 to 64% of eligible R&D costs depending on the company structure and the province of operation. But like anything tax related, getting funds out of SR&ED is laborious and it's complex. There's actually a whole economy of lawyers and consultants to help firms get access to SR&ED at the end of the tax year, and sometimes up to 30% of a firm's return can end up paying those consultants. So I recommended a few changes. The first of which is reprioritizing a portion of SR&ED resources to specifically support engineering firms because those are the ones that are most likely to generate unique IP from their research. The second of which is around stacking credits. In the current state, we make it difficult for firms to stack SR&ED with other innovation or R&D program costs, and both IRAP and provincial innovation credits are intensive to apply for. I invite us to shift the perspective to see that acceptance into programs like IRAP is a signal of quality research, and that stacking treats this as positive validation rather than a conflict of interest. I would also like us to pilot default approval. In the same way that not everyone needs to be audited when they file their personal taxes, I'd like to pilot a model where repeat firms, the ones that are consistently doing research and are successful securing SR&ED funds, are able to submit the information needed and then receive their credits. We see this in countries that are highly competitive, like Australia and Ireland, who deliberately make R&D programs easy for firms to access. For them, it's often just a checkbox on an existing corporate tax filing. Ultimately, it's about reducing the barriers to conduct R&D, with cost often being the largest. Improvements in the delivery of the program support all three of the objectives outlined and can influence how quickly Canada sees SR&ED used to increase capital investments. So my recommendation is aligned with the the SR&ED credit changes. I recognize that this option is likely to raise the big question that we started with, which is, if we've already spent a lot of public dollars on this problem without a lot of success, what makes this proposal any different? So we can go through each of the changes to sort of identify that. By focusing a portion of those resources on engineering firms, SR&ED is more likely to be supporting R&D projects that actually generate valuable IP, meaning that that same budget is more likely to increase domestic patent filings. And when we think about the restrictions around stacking credits, some evaluation has shown that projects that apply to more than one stream end up receiving less money back overall than if they'd stuck to just one program. Capital expenditures, which were the largest source of difficulties in identifying fraudulent or otherwise incorrect applications, are now accepted expenses under SR&ED, which is a clear demonstration that the misuse of these funds by firms is unlikely. I think work should be done to collaborate with provincial partners to identify whether the incentives available are accidentally cannibalizing each other, especially when other competitive countries don't face the same interjurisdictional limits. Ideally, stacking costs creates an environment where Canada sees larger and more ambitious R&D projects that are able to take place because the cash flow is less of a concern. Finally, by making this process more feasible for firms, the 30% of funds that would have traditionally gone to a lawyer or a consultant can now be put back into the important R&D that's needed without changing the overall SR&ED budget. There are trade-offs on this strategy. I'm not sure if I've got another slide there, but there are trade-offs in this strategy. R&D spending doesn't necessarily equal more patents, which doesn't necessarily equal more economic success or competitiveness. We're also shifting around where and how oversight of this program is delivered, which always places government at more risk and increases the potential for more resources to be needed in the auditing if you offset it from the lawyers and the consultants. But I'd argue that it's a worthwhile test whether more precision, simpler applications, and modified governance can increase the accessibility and incentive for firms to engage in more research. These changes can be implemented with the existing budget and work with tools that Canada already has. Ultimately, I see these changes as complementary to the strategies put forward in Budget 2025, and they're aligned to the fiscal priorities set by this government. I will not suggest that this will solve all of Canada's innovation challenges, but this is one strategy in order to build a more globally competitive country. I want to thank you for your consideration, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm going to invite Mark as your first reader.
Thanks, Sarah. I really enjoyed this, and it had a couple of things in it that, to me, make for a winning approach when doing this kind of policy work. One that I take your kind of option 4 as option 1+.
Yeah.
And so looking at like where's the policy momentum, especially I think you do have a government that is trying to tackle this stuff and isn't, it's a tough nut to crack. And so you're saying not good enough yet. And I think your proposals are really practical. I especially like the default approval one. It just makes so much sense. And then the other thing I appreciated you did in this that generally is a good practice, and as people are going back and working on their papers is worth doing, is looking at that comparative framework between other countries that have done this better and pulling those in. And I think that really made the case on this, where it could have felt like, these are just Sarah's ideas and what we should do, but the fact that you have benchmarking from other countries really made the case clearer. So I think it's practical, doesn't require new law or new programs, and then you have that comparative piece, and it's programmatic, not legislative, which makes sense in the context of the topic you're covering. I guess the thing, this isn't really in the scope that you picked, so it's maybe not a critique of how you did it, but some of those trade-offs just feel so, or kind of things it doesn't address, so central in the gap to productivity. So new IP doesn't generate productivity. In fact, often it gets, walks out the door in brain drain or early stage acquisitions of companies or all of those things. And so, how we keep innovation here is just feels so, as we crack the investment part, critical. And then I think the other thing you said doesn't necessarily turn into productivity is the other piece, right? Is the diffusion and adoption. And in particular, I think the real disconnect between innovation funding and looking at global markets. I mean, I think a lot of times you not only get into that provincial federal funding problem you talked about with stacking, but also just the real kind of cultural push and I think even a little bit of a push in the incentive to narrow our lens to Canadian markets when obviously we're such a tiny market globally for so much of what we hope to produce. So I think it would be stronger if you even just put a nod to the commercialization piece and not just the IP piece, and then the global markets and export piece.
It's great feedback. Thank you so much. And I would happily talk to you about regional programs versus federal programs after 10 years working in a lot of these accelerators. I would love to have that conversation too.
Yeah, well, happy to.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you, Sarah. I'm going to applaud you both for keeping us right to time in your efficient presentations and remarks. And I am going to invite Zoha to join us on the spotlight. And Zoha, I will endeavor to give you control of the deck. You should have it now. Try to advance to the next slide by using your arrow keys.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be working on my end, unfortunately.
Okay, I will hop in there and see if I can. Can you try it? Try it now. Try to use your right and left keys and see if it moves the slides.
Nope.
No luck. Okay. I'll support you then. I'll play operations. You can go ahead and just cue me when you want me to advance to the next slide.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Cliff. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Today, I want to talk about something that is quietly shaping the financial lives of millions of Canadians. And so my capstone is called Unprotected by Design, and it makes a case for AI consumer protection in Canada's financial sector. Next slide, please. So here's a core issue. So Canada's financial sector has been steadily integrating algorithms into its services. So algorithms help run things like credit decisions, fraud detection, and investment tools. But these are pervasive, but they're not fully autonomous either. Human judgment still plays a role, and the problem is that human oversight of these algorithmic systems have become inherently limited, and that limitation creates a real risk for consumers. So Canada does not yet have a single AI-specific law for financial algorithms, but it does have a layered regulatory system. You have financial regulators, model risk rules, consumer protection laws, and privacy initiatives that together offer some protection when automated decision-making goes wrong. The issue here is that these tools were not designed for algorithmic decision-making. So as a result, these protections are fragmented, they're opaque to consumers, and often insufficient when automated systems cause harm. According to a Stats Canada report, expected AI usage in Canada's financial and insurance sector nearly doubled in 1 year. So it rose from 17.9% to 31.5% just between Q3 of 2024 and Q3 of 2025. So that is the single largest year-over-year jump within that report of any industry in Canada. So this rapid acceleration makes the regulatory gap not just a current problem, but an urgent one. Next slide, please. So of any viable policy response, there needs to be measured objectives. So my first objective is reducing identifiable harms. So it means clear standards that prevent algorithmic systems from producing biased or harmful decisions. Having a second objective, looking at increasing consumer autonomy. So people should be able to understand how a decision about them was made and what they can do about it. The third objective is establishing regulatory accountability and transparency. So when AI causes harm, there must be someone responsible for addressing it. Your fourth one is protecting equity. So AI tools should not deepen these existing barriers for marginalized communities that are trying to access financial services. And my fifth objective is protecting financial stability. So AI systems should not introduce vulnerabilities into Canada's broader financial infrastructure
presently. So with these 5 objectives, these are the analytical lens through which I evaluated every policy option. Next slide, please. So my first option is no action. So Canada maintains its current fragmented approach, relying on existing regulation and voluntary industry commitments. So this option actually advances limited few objectives that I have. So the rules we have were not built for algorithmic decision making. They cannot address automated bias. They cannot assign accountability to a system or offer consumers a meaningful path to challenge a machine-made decision. So its only advantage is that it carries the lowest implementation cost, but that cost is largely absorbed by consumers rather than the industry itself. So the status quo is not necessarily a neutral choice, but it is a deliberate decision to leave existing gaps unaddressed. Next slide, please. Option 2 asks the financial industry to regulate itself. So the government issues best practice guidelines, and institutions develop their own codes of conduct. So this partially advances transparency and consumer autonomy, so long as the individual firms choose to act. So accountability, equity, and financial stability remain largely unmet because there is no enforcement behind any of it. But firms facing competitive pressure have little incentive to absorb the cost of these meaningful transparency measures on their own. So this option is fast to implement, but it is unlikely to work effective at scale. Next slide, please. Option 3 directs existing regulators, so the OSFI, the FCAC, and provincial securities commissions, to update their mandates to address AI within their fields. So this is a meaningful improvement. It builds on institutions that already have legal authority and industry trust, and it advances accountability, harm reduction, and stability objectives. It is also politically feasible, but the core limitation is coordination. Financial services do not stay neatly within regulatory lanes, so a single AI product can touch banking, consumer protection, and security simultaneously. So without a formal coordinating mechanism, the result is inconsistent rules, overlapping jurisdictions, and gaps that can be exploited. So option 3 is better than the status quo, but it is not sufficient on its own. Next slide, please. Option 4 is a standalone federal AI in Finance Act. So with 3 core binding obligations: explainability, fairness audits, and consumer remediation. So explainability means institutions must provide a plain language explanation anytime an algorithm materially influences a financial decision. Fairness audits are regular independent third-party assessments of whether AI systems are producing equitable outcomes, and they're externally conducted and submitted to the relevant regulator. Then you have consumer remediation, which gives individuals a legal right to file a complaint and receive a formal response within a legislative timeframe when an algorithmic decision does harm. So with this, enforcement is distributed across your existing regulators, the OSFI, FCAC, and provincial commissions, but with a formal interagency coordination mechanism to close those jurisdictional gaps. So with that, startup costs are publicly funded, ongoing costs are recovered through industry levies, consistent with how OSFI already operates, so institutions bear the cost of their own third-party audits. But the trade-off is adaptability, so locking rules into statute carries the risk of the framework becoming outdated before full implementation, just given how quickly AI evolves, but the framework is required to keep pace with technological change. Next slide, please. All right, option 5 also uses federal legislation, but rather than encoding the rules directly, it creates a new specialized regulatory body empowered to set, enforce, and update AI standards over time. So this is the only option that combines legal force with institutional adaptability, and it comes closest to fully meeting all 5 objectives. So by standing up a new body with genuine AI expertise and cross-sectoral jurisdiction, it takes significant time and resources. It also requires sustained political will across electoral cycles. So a new institution is more vulnerable to being stalled or defunded when governments change than a statute already on the books. So the startup risk is real, and it is the primary reason I would not recommend this path. And with that, it leads to my recommendation. Thank you. So after evaluating all 5 options against the 5 objectives, I would recommend option 4, a dedicated federal AI in Finance Act. So options 1 and 2 have regulatory gaps, unresolved, and depend on voluntary compliance that is unlikely to be consistent. Option 3 improves coordination but still permits jurisdictional loopholes. Option 5 offers adaptability but introduces substantial institutional risk and an uncertain timeline. So option 4 is the option that most credibly advances all 5 objectives with enforcement behind it. And with that, I'll walk you through how it actually works in practice. So in year 1, Parliament would enact the AI and Finance Act with support of the parties. And from that point, all federally regulated financial institutions are subject to the 3 binding obligations. So explainability, fairness audits, and consumer remediation. And with that, we would go into year 2 where mandatory audits begin with compliance timelines phase. So large institutions face earlier deadlines, with smaller fintechs receiving a graduated timeline to avoid disproportionate burden. You have penalties that will escalate. So first violations result in remediation orders and public disclosure, and then repeat violations to attract financial penalties. Systemic non-compliance can actually trigger supervisory intervention by the OSFI themselves. With the funding model, it's designed to be sustainable without depending on ongoing government appropriations. You'll have initial startup costs covering the drafting and passage of the Act, establishing interagency coordination mechanism. So it's a modest investment relative to the scale of the sector being regulated. And ongoing operation costs are recovered through industry levies, fees charged to regulate institutions based on the size and complexity of their AI operations. And then with that, the result is a framework that becomes fiscally self-sustaining within the first few years of full implementation without relying on budget cycles or changes in government to stay funded. And then with that risk mitigation, you have the adaptability risk, locking in the statute, meaning the framework becomes outdated as AI evolves, as well as implementation timeline where legislative reform realistically takes 2 to 4 years through Parliament. That is a longer than issuing guidance. However, encouraging institutions to begin voluntary compliance before the Act formally takes effect is also very critical. So with that, Canadians deserve to know when an algorithm is making decisions about their financial lives. They deserve to understand why, and they deserve a path to challenge those decisions when they cause harm. And that is what this Act delivers. And with that, thank you for listening to my presentation, and I will open the floor to any comments, feedbacks, or questions.
Thank you very much, Zoha. I will invite Graham to join us with his feedback.
Yeah, I mean that was cool. I like that that presentation a lot. Yeah, so I mean it's just as a general reflection, every single presentation that's dealt with AI and some aspect of it, one of the objectives is always reducing harm, which is like an interesting commentary on the potential of these technologies, but also strikes me as a very Canadian policy frame to sort of approach. It's like we're actually going to prioritize keeping people whole as a policy response. So that was interesting to see. I wrote down the line you had: fast to implement, unlikely to work. I actually want to get that on a T-shirt. I think that is a great sort of distillation of how that works. But yeah, I mean, you sort of you had me going there for a second, where like you were kind of setting up option 5, like the new regulator to be your sort of recommendation. I was like, oh no, not another new regulator. And then you went back to 4, which I thought was a great move, because I think that there's a lot of strength in the way you set up that piece of legislation and sort of I mean, there's always kind of an interesting kind of policy dynamic or question is like we have to pass legislation to get existing regulators to work together on an issue. But it was yeah, I liked the way you set up that particular legislative intervention, because you know, as we've discussed in a few other ones, like if we want to reduce harm, if we want to prevent the possibility of harm, we do require some kind of like legal legislative anchor to make those kinds of things happen. So yeah, I don't really have a question there, but yeah, I thought that was well done.
Wonderful. Thanks, Graham. Maybe I'll invite Mark. We have a minute or two left in this round. Anything you wanted to add to that, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I also kind of appreciated the fake where you got us, you know, thinking you were going to go to 5 and go back to 4, and then I just wondered and you know, made the question of, once you get to 4, do we have the agency infrastructure to implement it? And you know, so it feels like 4 is the right thing. And then I have what you guys are now probably learning is my standard question of, is there anybody else doing this already in other jurisdictions, you know, better, even if it's anybody who's considering regulation on this? This is a pretty common thing that countries, societies, people, banks, everywhere are dealing with. So I think as you go to your final paper to make sure to surface some of the comparative analysis of who else is trying to do what. But I thought it was a strong presentation.
Thank you so much. I do appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Zoha. Thank you, Graham and Mark. And Mark, never feel any trepidation or reticence about hammering home that question. I think comparative policy analysis is something we always want to make sure that we're across.
I'm going to have to come back and threaten to do the case study course with you again.
That's right. I was just going to say.
We can just like hammer on.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you very much. Let's just close the spotlights and invite Nina to join us. I'll just spotlight you, Nina, and then I'm going to try to give you control of the deck and see if that works. So it looks like you have control. Are you able to advance your slides? Great.
Ooh. Yes, but I'm giving away all the goods. Okay, hopefully I'm able to maintain the control, but like everybody else. Sorry about that. Okay, if you're good, I'm ready to get started.
Yes, please go for it.
Okay, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. My name's Nina, and today I'll be discussing a critical frontier in my home province, so the race to build data centers in Alberta. So before we begin, why is winning the AI infrastructure race even important? There's so many competing priorities for Canadians, from housing to jobs, education. So why should we be focusing on data centers? So data centers are about 3 pillars. The first, data sovereignty and security. So over the past several months, we've seen how important it is to be independent and resilient in a world of geopolitical tension. We must be the landlords and not just the tenants of our digital assets. And so I want to borrow from Billy Talent's acceptance speech at the Junos this weekend, where they say that now is the time to be Canadian. Second is economic modernization. Data centers attract elite capital and talent from engineers, cybersecurity experts, hardware innovators, and most importantly, policymakers. So, and thirdly, energy recyclers. We can turn a high consumption industry into a laboratory for renewable methodologies, helping Canada reach our 2050 net zero goal. So while this all sounds great, why is Alberta losing the AI infrastructure race? Despite our land, our energy, and a strategy, Alberta is losing ground. What we're facing is a friction point where 3 levels of government collide. Our federal government is concerned with national security. Our province has authority over natural resources and utilities, and our municipal government has the authority to veto land use and bylaws. Or sorry, they have the authority to present a veto due to their land use and bylaws. So this isn't just an issue across Canada. We have seen Quebec move forward with their TELUS sovereign AI factory. So Alberta remains bogged down in its jurisdictional silos. So to address this, I have come up with 4 policy objectives for Alberta to win. First is speed. By optimizing permit to completion, which allows us to bypass the municipal veto volatility. Second is equity, moving beyond just consultation to ensure that we have a truly equitable practice with Indigenous nations. Third, stewardship, developing ethical environmental practices to protect Alberta's land and avoid orphan data wells. I'll go into that a little bit later. And then lastly, sovereignty, securing Canadian data on Canadian soil. So to address these, I have 5 policy options. The first being, what is our current framework, which includes the Bill 12 levy, Bill 8, which is Bring Your Own Energy, and the Municipal Government Act. So of these, what we could do is replace the upfront 2% levy and switch it to a traditional municipal property tax to lower entry barriers and where the profits can be shared with the province and the municipalities. Additionally, we can also create areas of provincial interest to prevent critical projects from being stalled by local opposition. Now, the trade-offs here are that property taxes can be volatile for investors, but staying the course causes fragmentation, where we miss out on the efficiency of what could be clusters. So while we may gain some speed, we miss out on equity, stewardship, and sovereignty. The second policy option is to unlock access to capital, and we can look at tax reform. This is something that we see in Texas that has attracted many data center developments. Of these options, we can work with banks like Scotiabank and TD to offer lower interest rates for Canadian investors in the data center industry. Further, we could offer targeted credits for sustainable solutions and consider reducing GST on compute materials. This could also encourage foreign investors to partner with Canadian companies. What I would love to see in this option is that if we do have foreign investors, that they are working with Canadian companies across the spectrum of services, so that data centers are majority owned, designed, and operated by Canadians. My third option is to secure the social license, ensuring that environmental excellence is our entry fee. So of this, what we can do is encourage public ownership and financial incentives for energy companies, technology innovators, and universities to help develop renewable sources for data centers. Of this, we could have mandates of 50% materials that are used in data centers to be made with renewable materials, or require data centers to be funding carbon capture facilities. So while these mandates do increase the upfront costs, they prevent the water competition that we have with our agriculture industry. And additionally, we are in quite a water scarce province. My fourth option is to develop Indigenous protected and conserved areas. Again, the relationship is not just about a box-ticking exercise. What we need to do is develop special land zones designed with and for Indigenous nations. A key requirement would be hiring 50% Indigenous-owned companies for post-construction maintenance. What typically happens with Indigenous relations is that the Indigenous groups are part of the conversation prior to essentially the ground being broken. And then what happens is once the building is up, Indigenous groups are no longer part of the conversation, and they don't have access to any revenue sources or have a say in what is happening, even though the structure is still on their land. So here, what my option is to continue that maintenance post-construction so that it ensures that Indigenous nations are still continuing to have a voice and they continue to receive economic return on the buildings that are built on their land. And the last of my suggestions is a data center cluster. So these would be special economic zones co-locating data centers with power plants and recycling facilities. They'd be managed by a digital concierge, which would be essentially a project manager or experts within the provincial and municipal government that can help to streamline the process to ensure that when applications are coming in, if there are any concerns, they're being dealt with immediately and not waiting until the end once the application has been submitted to be rejected. And additionally, we could offer lowering personal taxes for investors who commit to these co-owned Indigenous partnered clusters. And for the moment we're all waiting for, the recommendation. So the recommendation would be my fifth policy option, which is the data center cluster model. So this helps to address the 4 objectives I had outlined at the beginning of my presentation. Having established pre-zoned clusters ensures that we're using the land of Alberta in an ethical way and we're not concentrating data centers in one area. We're also providing that digital concierge, which creates a predictable plug-and-play environment. Second, on the equity piece, we'll institutionalize Indigenous equity ownership as a path to economic reconciliation. Third, the stewardship. We must mandate the closed-loop liquid cooling and reclamation security plans, again, to avoid those orphan data cells. And the reason I'm referring to them as orphan data centers is because we did, through our oil and gas industry, many orphan wells are just across our province, and that is a huge risk to our environment and to our economy. And lastly, sovereignty. We ensure that Canadian data is processed on Canadian soil using Alberta's energy. So by measuring twice and digging once, we aren't just building a warehouse for servers, we're building the foundation for Alberta's future economy. So thank you so much, and I welcome your questions and feedback.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Nina. I'm going to invite Manon to the spotlight. There we go.
Thank you. It's a very interesting presentation. I'm not quite sure what to do with it. But I think like the angle I'd like to take is the federal provincial approach to this. I think in terms of the presentation itself,
there's a bit of a, I don't want to say confusion, a certain like vagueness in terms of like, is that recommendations you would be putting to the provincial government, or is this recommendations that you would be putting to the federal government? Because some of the measures and the options would have to be implemented by one or the other. So there's a bit of a joint kind of proposal, right? That both governments should work together to sort of make it happen. But then you have two governments with very different approaches to things in general. So how do you kind of make the sales pitch slightly like differently adapted to each kind of like, audience? Which is and I get you only have one presentation to make and not two, one for each level of government. So that's not necessarily like possible, but it's just like it's an interesting thing because like some of those ideas would be particularly appealing to the federal government. Like if you're talking about like data sovereignty, this is really something that we're worried about. If you're talking about like the climate issues, like okay, yeah, you're speaking sort of our language. It's like okay, you're thinking GST reduction. Okay, well we could sort of help bring investments and like that. But then you have stuff that's really of interest to the provinces. Is like. But then that from a federal government, we're just a little bit maybe uncomfortable with. It's like because you're trying to put Alberta first type language, like it's about like being a leader in Canada for those types of things where we're like, well, we need to sort of balance across the country and those types of shape. So I think that's fascinating to sort of think through in these types of policy proposal and the way this current government is working, you could totally see these types of initiatives be developed through kind of mechanisms that's sort of like major project office, like these types of ideas of bringing sort of people together to sort of accelerate and think through those processes and bring all the different actors to the table to actually make it happen. It's maybe something in terms of like looking at implementation that you can think about.
That's actually exactly where I was going with this. And like that is where the inspiration came from, is the major projects office. I think prior to that being established, I didn't think it would be possible. I think we're a little bit fortunate that the major projects office is headquartered in Calgary. But I do believe like both the federal and provincial government have spoken about data centers, have spoken about the priorities around AI. They are investing billions. So I think while there may be some differences in the approach, overall, the goal is the same. So I would love to have something like in my ideal world, it would almost be an extension of the major projects office, and this becomes a project within there. And I think that would be the way to streamline this. The other thing is, I believe it's under Bill 8, but with the with the Municipal Governance Act, there was an update that the province does have the authority to override a municipality's decision if it conflicts with a province's priority. So I think from that perspective, I'm not as concerned as provincial and municipal government. Municipal governments fall under the province anyway, but I would be more looking at federal and provincial and using a major projects office approach.
Yeah, it's good. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. How do you think that would be received, Manon, out of curiosity? Nina's pitch.
Well, I think through the major projects office, there's definitely some interest. Like I'm not super familiar with like what kind of projects exactly fall into this. So I think there's something there. I mean, from an Eastern Canada perspective, it's like, well, there's our energy thing. So like you can imagine the Quebec government being, well, why don't you take like hydroelectricity for these types of projects as opposed to take things, but if you're pushing the climate agenda. So I think balancing those different views across the country would be an interesting challenge. But I think it would be of interest.
And you know what? There's like a petition for Alberta to separate. So maybe this is our moment. Well, we won't leave you guys. But I just do want to comment back on the hydro piece that I think, yes, I totally understand that. And that is like a more renewable approach. I think what's really interesting about this paradox, like having an industry that is so heavy on the emissions, is that we have an opportunity to be innovative with our solutions. And again, like in this ideal world that I've painted, it's that we're coming to solve these issues of climate and using the data centers as our like laboratory, as our testing space, and that we can come up with these new technologies that we can push across other industries.
I have a super silly question. Because I don't know the technology at all, right? Part of the energy is like cooling, right?
Yeah.
So is there like any benefits of, we're the Great North
to go even like more north in the territories, and then like you sort of, I don't know.
You can, yeah, you absolutely can. I think like the counter to that is that there's also data centers in Texas, and Texas is definitely way more south and much more hotter than it is here. But the really unique thing about the cooling, and I think what the TELUS Sovereign AI Factory has done, is that they actually recycle the heat. So that is something that the cooling, we may not necessarily need as much effort to cool our data centers, but what we can do is the heat that is emitted, we can recycle it and use it in other places.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Nina. So Nina's been something of a thought leader of this already and sort of published work, and so it's interesting for I think for you, Nina, to get the experience of hearing from a government official on what some of the, at least the federal government responses might be to that sort of proposals. Thank you, Manon, for that. Great. Let's move forward. Okay, and I'd like to bring in Zora to the spotlight and share control of the deck. Hopefully. All right, you should be able to advance slides. Yeah, looks like you can.
Okay, sounds good. All right, good afternoon, everyone. My capstone presentation will be on Indigenous data sovereignty, specifically through modernizing the Privacy Act. So the current Privacy Act is built around an individual-based model of privacy, which does not reflect Indigenous approaches to data governance. So evidence from Indigenous organizations, particularly the First Nations Information Governance Center, indicates that Indigenous communities have historically had limited control over how their data is collected, used, and shared by federal institutions. This has led to recurring issues such as lack of consent, restricted access to community data, and external control over information that directly shapes Indigenous governance. The implications extend beyond Indigenous communities as well. Like, for example, for ordinary Canadians, this can create a system where public policies, especially in areas like health, education, and social services, may rely on incomplete or misaligned data, reducing overall policy effectiveness. So as a result, the Privacy Act not only fails to support Indigenous data sovereignty, but also conflicts with Canada's broader commitments to reconciliation and United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. To address this issue, the policy recommendation needs to achieve the key objectives. First, it must reflect the diversity of Indigenous governance, meaning it moves beyond narrow or outdated definition categories and recognizes the distinct and legal and political identities of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. Second, it must ensure meaningful Indigenous authority over data, so shifting communities from being treated as stakeholders to being more active decision makers in how data is collected, used, and shared. Third, it must recognize collective privacy rights alongside individual rights, since Indigenous data often represents shared cultural knowledge and community interests. And finally, it must improve access to federally held data, so Indigenous communities can actually use that information for governance, service delivery, and decision making. So together, these objectives focus on shifting both how data is understood and who has power over it. So based on these objectives, I evaluate 4 policy options. The first option focuses on administrative reform through improved data classification. Specifically, it proposes updating the definitions used in federal systems to better reflect distinctions between Indigenous groups, such as First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. For instance, current narrow definitions in the Privacy Act frequently exclude First Nations women, non-status individuals identifying as Indigenous, Métis, Nation citizens, and those living off reserves or outside land claim settlement areas. So with this framework, it would improve the accuracy of government data, reduce misclassification, and ensure that policies are based on more culturally appropriate information. It also has the advantage of being relatively easy to implement, since it builds on existing federal structures. So evidence from existing federal practices, such as the distinctions-based approaches used in Statistics Canada, suggest this option would improve the accuracy and cultural relevance of Indigenous data. However, the key limitation is that it does not change who controls the data. Decision-making authority still remains with federal institutions, meaning Indigenous communities are still positioned as subjects of data rather than decision makers. So while this option does improve representation, it does not meaningfully address the underlying power imbalance. So my second option takes a more structural approach to that issue. The second option introduces a co-governance data authority framework. So under this approach, federal institutions would be required to share decision-making authority with Indigenous communities through formal mechanisms like consent processes, negotiated data governance agreements, and joint oversight structures. This aligns closely with the OCAP principles, ownership, control, access, and possession, and with Canada's commitments under UN DRIP. What makes this option significant is that it directly addresses the issue of power by redistributing authority over how Indigenous data is collected, used, and shared. So instead of being external to the process, Indigenous communities become active partners in governance. The main trade-off is increased administrative complexity, and decision-making may take longer, and coordination between governments may be more demanding. However, this complexity reflects the reality of shared governance and is necessary to achieve meaningful change. The third option approaches the issue from a different angle by redefining privacy itself. So the third option introduces a collective privacy rights framework. This expands on the current model of privacy to recognize that Indigenous data is not only about individuals, but also about communities, cultures, and shared knowledge. So in practice, this would require federal institutions to conduct community-level privacy impact assessments before collecting or using Indigenous data, ensuring that potential harms to communities are considered. An example of a past implication of the lack of protection of collective privacy is illustrated through the Canada versus Fontaine 2017 case study. So the Supreme Court had ruled that residential school independent assessment processes records fell outside the Privacy Act due to its strict confidentiality, resulting in their destruction unless preserved by the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, which highlighted a gap where collective historical harms can be lost. Comparative research, also including Indigenous data governance models in countries like New Zealand, show that collective privacy frameworks can work better to address risks such as misuse of cultural knowledge and harmful data narratives. And this approach is particularly strong in protecting against misuse of culturally sensitive information and preventing harmful or stigmatizing research. However, it does introduce significant legal and practical challenges. For instance, it can raise questions about who has the authority to represent a community and how community consent is defined, or how it conflicts between individual and collective rights. So while this option strengthens protections, it may be difficult to implement consistently within existing legal frameworks. So the fourth option focuses less on governance and more on access. The fourth option is a data access framework. It aims to reduce the information gap between federal institutions and Indigenous communities by ensuring that Indigenous communities have timely and consistent access to data held by the government. And this includes historical records, treaty data, and information relevant to service delivery and policy planning. For instance, during the COVID-19 pandemic, Indigenous communities faced significant access gaps in data, hindering their ability to plan responses, or hold leaders accountable. And the strength of this approach is that it supports capacity building and allows Indigenous communities to make more informed decisions in areas like healthcare, education, and land claims. However, the limitation is that it does not change who ultimately controls the data again. The federal institutions still determine how data is collected and used, and this option simply improves the access to it. So while it addresses information asymmetry, it does not directly address authority or governance. So based on this analysis, I recommend adopting the co-governance data authority framework. This approach stands out because it is the only option that directly addresses the root issue, which is the imbalance of power over Indigenous data. So by establishing shared decision-making through consent processes, negotiated agreements, and joint oversight, it shifts Indigenous communities from being data subjects to being decision makers. And yes, as I mentioned, this approach does introduce administrative complexity and may slow down certain processes, but those trade-offs are justified in the broader context of reconciliation and Indigenous self-determination. So in comparison, the other options improve specific aspects of the system, like classification, protection, or access, but they do not fundamentally change who holds authority. So this option, however, creates a structural shift in governance while still maintaining a workable federal framework. It also aligns with Canada's commitments under UN DRIP and builds on existing Indigenous governance models like OCAP, making it both principled and feasible. So if the goal is reconciliation, then improving processes isn't enough. Sorry, I missed a slide.
Do you want me to advance it?
Yes, just advance one more time.
There you go.
Yeah, this one was just focusing more on the trade-offs compared to the payoffs. But in the end, if the goal is reconciliation, then improving processes isn't enough. Meaningful reform requires a shift in power, and this is the only option that achieves that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to invite Mark in as your first reader.
Thanks, Laura. That was a great presentation. I have too many questions, but you really got my brain going, and I especially appreciated, well, I think two things. I appreciated in your recommendation, maybe you can put that slide back up, that we're talking about a very deep set of issues of which data is only an indicator of the reconciliation that's needed and the power dynamics that need to be resolved. So I really appreciate the slower, deeper approach. I don't think you kind of get at those things without that. So I liked your recommendation. And I also really appreciated kind of switched my brain on this, that you kind of focus on collective as opposed to individual rights as a kind of frame on this. And other people have kind of done some interesting work on that. So I liked all of that stuff. I guess the question I had is in the co-ownership model, which I like, is the scope, who you're talking about co-owning is Indigenous communities and governments. Is that right?
Yes.
And so that's really just speaking about data that governments have right now and creating Indigenous rights over that, or would it be broader than that? Because I guess when I think about Indigenous data sovereignty, there's also questions of cultural knowledge and things that right now Indigenous communities hold to themselves that may not be digital. And I would imagine they probably wouldn't want to co-own that with the federal government.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it is a bit broader than just existing government data. So I feel like my model definitely applies to data that federal institutions already hold. And I feel like that's a good starting point. But things like administrative data and program data and survey data, that's where co-governance, I would say, would kick in. So I would say that when it involves partnerships, like when the federal government is working with provinces or researchers or even private actors, in those cases, co-governance could be built into the terms of those agreements. So it extends just beyond what the federal government directly controls, I would say, if that answers your question.
A little bit. I think there's then a third piece that maybe as you go in your final report to think about, which is, and I can put some links in the chat of things that fall out even of the categories you talked about and kind of are more in cultural knowledge. I mean, the place you see it a lot is in Indigenous languages, and that those would be things that often Indigenous communities from a sovereignty perspective really want to control that data themselves and not cede it to anyone else. And so there's some good examples of Maori communities really taking innovative approaches to controlling language data and cultural data on their own terms and not really controlling the terms in which other people access it. So I think there's maybe a circle out from government data and then the other co-ownership data you're talking about to cultural knowledge, or I don't know where the circles go, but I think there's another scope to look at there. Okay. But great presentation.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you, Zoha. I will move on to the next presentation. So I'm going to invite Jen. Just let me find Jen. There she is. Jen, I'm going to give you access to the deck. You should have that now if this worked properly.
Okay, I'm just going to test it out here.
You should be able to hit your arrow buttons on your keyboard. Maybe click once on the deck first to activate it.
Okay.
And see. Yes.
Oh, there we go. Perfect. Thank you. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Jaffar, and today I'm going to be talking about AI literacy learning across Ontario schools. So AI technology is here to stay, but Ontario students are already facing a disadvantage when it comes to learning how to safely and appropriately use AI tools. AI is evolving quickly and it affects us in our everyday lives. So providing students with the knowledge of how to appropriately and safely interact with these tools is becoming an important life skill now more than ever. In this respect, I'm talking about AI literacy, referring to the ability to responsibly use AI supports as an assistive tool while also understanding the limitations it can present. So a bit of information. KPMG conducted a survey back in October of 2025 and found that 73% of Canadian students are already using AI tools in their schoolwork, which is already an increase from 59% the previous year. Additionally, it was found that 77% of students said that they wanted to learn how to use AI in schools, with over half of them again stating that they felt like they were cheating when they used AI tools and that their critical thinking skills were deteriorating. So currently, there are no policies in place to regulate or require access to AI literacy in Ontario schools. And so this is creating a fragmented approach to AI literacy learning, in addition to furthering a digital divide that's already being experienced by many Ontario communities, especially those in more rural and northern areas. Okay. There we go. Okay, so here are some objectives that a successful AI literacy policy could strive to address. With the first one, having students develop informed AI literacy skills while interacting with or using AI tools. The second one is ensuring equal access to digital infrastructure for all Ontario communities for AI literacy learning to take place in schools. Third is having teachers who have knowledge of and the ability to use AI literacy skills in order to enhance student learning. And then lastly, having parents and guardians that are confident in the school curriculum and understand how it supports and enhances AI literacy learning. So my first option is an AI literacy curriculum. And so this would be having the Ministry of Education create the AI literacy curriculum for all Ontario school boards to implement and abide by. This option advances three of the objectives, which are students developing informed AI literacy skills, ensuring equal access to digital infrastructure for all Ontario schools, and also promotes confidence in parents and guardians in the curriculum. This option also provides a measurable learning, provides more measurable learning outcomes, but the trade-offs are obviously the financial costs and the implementation time. Creating a new curriculum means working with AI experts, looking into digital infrastructure, and also having to update some of that infrastructure in certain communities and schools. And so that all takes time to create, implement, and roll out, meaning that it could still be a few years away from implementation. And as we know, AI technology advances very quickly. The next option would be having a teacher training incentive. So this would create a new AI literacy micro-credential or additional qualification program for teachers specifically to take. This option advances one of the objectives where teachers have the knowledge of and the ability to use AI literacy skills to enhance student learning, and it's more financially and administratively appealing. But again, however, the trade-offs are having inconsistencies of teachers who choose to complete this training, and it doesn't really provide any measurability for student learning outcomes. Another option is board developed framework and policy. So this option provides the school board to develop AI literacy frameworks and policies. It gives the board the freedom to develop and implement a program within their budget constraints and preferences. This option also advances two of the objectives, having students develop informed AI literacy skills and parent-guardian confidence in the curriculum. This option, like the first option, provides a more measurable approach to student learning. But again, some trade-offs with this include uneven learning outcomes across school boards in Ontario, and it can create a risk of furthering a digital divide and inequities that are experienced by rural and northern communities or other marginalized communities. Okay. The fourth option is having parent guardian-led AI literacy. So this option sees the school board assisting with providing basic AI literacy foundation information for parents and guardians to access through a learning portal or some other method and teach their students about AI literacy at home. So while this option is more financially appealing and takes a lot of the workload away from schools, the trade-offs include transferring that financial burden onto parents as well as the time constraints being put directly onto families. This option doesn't really advance any of the objectives as there's no way to measure student learning outcomes or ensure that there's, again, parent or guardian participation. And another consideration would be accessibility issues for families who, again, don't have access to technology or have access to appropriate digital infrastructure. And the last option is remaining with the status quo. So this would mean that there's no AI literacy framework or policies in place and that the school boards could decide on their own if they want to create something and put funding towards it. Again, while this is financially appealing, there's no changes or updates required at the ministry level. The trade-offs continue to be seeing fragmented approaches to AI literacy across the Ontario schools. And there's also a trade-off and risk that students will continue to use AI tools for their schoolwork without clear guidance and risk further deteriorating critical thinking skills. So with all of that being said, my recommendation is the AI literacy curriculum. While the trade-offs of this option include a higher financial investment than some of the others, and it would take longer to implement, it does advance 3 of the objectives for having students demonstrate informed AI literacy skills, equal access to digital infrastructure for learning to take place, and having parents and guardians who are confident in the curriculum and have a clear understanding of how that curriculum supports AI literacy learning. Lastly, this option also provides standardization across Ontario schools, making it easier to measure and evaluate student learning outcomes. When compared to the other options presented, this approach helps to reduce fragmented AI literacy learning, in addition to reducing AI learning inequities, which some of the other options risk promoting. Thank you, and I open the floor for questions or comments.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jen. I'm going to invite Graham as your first reader.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's really interesting, and I mean we've had kind of 2 different flavors of AI learning, which is always instructive. Yeah, I mean, I kind of right off the bat, like and sort of making the case, like the change imperative, and it's like making it clear that. Well, it's not parents, it's not administrators, it's the actual students want to learn this stuff. So I thought that was really impactful to kind of begin with that data sort of setting the stage. Yeah, and I mean, going to the curriculum piece, like having a standalone curriculum. I mean, yeah, I think it is the most, has the potential to be the most effective, but you correctly identified, I think, some of the concerns and problems. My question would be just around, just one of the things that characterizes education systems in Canada is sort of the level of union density, and how that interacts with like workload and curricular change and things like that. And if you had any thoughts on how the introduction of a whole new kind of curriculum within the existing framework would how that would kind of interplay with union dynamics.
Yeah, definitely something that I considered. And I'll be completely honest, part of the difficulty, I think, of what my research has found in finding the, a suitable recommendation was, a standalone curriculum or kind of an integrated curriculum across subjects so that it's not quite as maybe in-depth, time-consuming for teachers. Because, of course, we know that they are really strapped for time, they do so much. And so adding on a whole nother subject for teachers to become, not specialists in, but very comfortable in teaching is always a concern. So I definitely think there would be some huge union considerations, probably more, I should have gone into further detail, including that in some of the trade-off section, because again, that's something to really consider. And I think that again is always kind of the debate that I've had throughout is, I started the approach looking kind of at the sexual health education and looking at how that model was kind of introduced, and you know, having a complete standalone or having that integration throughout other subjects has been a big confusing research point. So you're right, it's a huge consideration and definitely something that I think deserves more in-depth research into for this.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I think it's something to consider for the final report. And yeah, I think it's a good underline of like how context matters. I mean, Ontario's got a bit of a like a rocky history with you know, its union relationships, but you know, might be easier to do in Ontario now than say in Alberta, where they're like in a very difficult position with their unions currently. So yeah, it's just like the local kind of combination of characteristics is always determined.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Graham, and thank you, Jennifer. Let's move to our final presentation. I'm going to invite Atta into the spotlight and endeavor to give you control of the deck, which you should now have. Yes.
1 second. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Healthcare is the largest area of public spending in Canada, with expenditures approaching approximately $300 billion annually. And yet, despite this level of investment, the system continues to face persistent inefficiencies, including delays in care, administrative burden, and uneven patient outcomes. And so today I focus on one important contributor to these inefficiencies. That is the lack of interoperability in Canada's electronic health records. And to be clear from the outset, I'm not suggesting that interoperability is the sole cause of these challenges. Rather, I'm suggesting or arguing that it's a significant and policy-driven source of inefficiency, one that stems from how governance, procurement, and privacy frameworks are currently structured. In Canada, patient health information remains fragmented across institutions, regions, and digital platforms. Clinicians frequently lack access to complete patient records during care delivery, and health system administrators face ongoing challenges in collecting and using data for planning, quality improvement, and public health monitoring. The issue is that these systems operate in silos and do not communicate effectively with one another. This fragmentation reflects a policy problem rooted in institutional design rather than technological limitations. Firstly, governance is fragmented across federal, provincial, and institutional actors, with no single entity clearly accountable for interoperability outcomes. Procurement practices prioritize immediate functionality and local needs, and limiting data exchange across systems. Privacy frameworks, while essential for protecting patient data, are interpreted inconsistently across institutions, creating uncertainty that discourages data sharing. And together, these factors reinforce one another and sustain fragmentation across the health system. The consequences of this fragmentation extend beyond technical inconvenience. It contributes directly to clinical delays, duplicated diagnostic testing, increased administrative burden, and higher system costs. In many cases, clinicians are unable to access prior test results, leading to unnecessary repetition of those procedures. This not only increases financial strain on the system, but also negatively affects patient outcomes through delays in care. And at a broader level, fragmented data, it limits public health coordination and reduces the system's ability to respond effectively to population health needs. So while interoperability is not the only issue facing the health system, it's a clear and measurable contributor to efficiency in care delivery. Given this context, the goal is to improve how data flows across the existing systems or across systems. Specifically, the policy objectives are number one, to improve clinician access to complete patient information at the point of care. Number two, reduce unnecessary duplication of diagnostic testing. Number three, enable data sharing across institutions for both clinical and public health purposes. Number four, clarify responsibility for interoperability outcomes. And number five, maintain public trust and privacy protection. The first policy option is conditional funding. Under this approach, federal health transfers would be tied to measurable interoperability outcomes, such as data exchange capabilities or reductions in duplicate testing. This strategy is attractive because it creates a strong financial incentive for change, and it can accelerate adoption of interoperable systems. However, it may lead to uneven adoption across various jurisdictions, particularly where institutional capacity differs quite significantly. It may also be perceived as federal overreach into provincial jurisdiction, which could reduce political feasibility and therefore lead to resistance. So while the option is effective in theory, it carries both political and distributional risks. The second option is procurement reform. This strategy focuses on how digital health systems are purchased and embedded into the healthcare system. Rather than attempting to retrofit interoperability after systems are implemented, it embeds interoperability requirements at the point of acquisition. In practice, this would involve requiring standardized data formats and exchange protocols, mandating vendor data portability, requiring open interfaces that allow the systems to communicate, and it would prioritize interoperability in procurement evaluation criteria. This approach targets the supply side of the system, specifically vendor behavior and system design. And the main trade-off here is that impact is gradual, since we have existing legacy systems already in place. The third option focuses on governance restructuring and accountability. This would involve assigning clear responsibility for interoperability outcomes to designated health agencies and introducing performance monitoring frameworks. This approach directly addresses the current lack of accountability, the reality that no single entity is responsible for ensuring system-wide integration. However, governance reform alone has limitations. Without enforcement mechanisms or financial incentives, simply improved coordination does not necessarily translate into meaningful technical implementation. So while it strengthens institutional alignment, it may not drive meaningful change on its own. The fourth option is privacy clarification. This strategy focuses on harmonizing interpretations of privacy legislation and providing clear guidance on when data sharing is legally permissible. This reduces uncertainty and addresses the risk-averse behavior that currently discourages interoperability. It also plays an important role in maintaining public trust, which is essential for any data sharing, particularly healthcare data sharing initiatives. However, again, the approach does not address technical barriers, procurement practices, or vendor incentives. So while necessary, it's not sufficient as a standalone solution. And so based on this analysis, procurement reform, which is option 2, is the recommended policy approach. This option provides the best balance between effectiveness, feasibility, and alignment with Canada's institutional structure. It is effective in the long term because it ensures that new systems entering the health system are designed for interoperability right from the very outset. And it's feasible because it operates within existing governance arrangements without requiring any centralization or major political governance changes. And it's sustainable because it gradually reshapes vendor behavior and system design across the entire health system. The main trade-off, as mentioned, is that progress is slower in the short term. However, given Canada's constraints, such as federalism, legacy systems, privacy considerations, long-term sustainability is more important than rapid but unstable change. And so Canada's healthcare system faces many complex challenges, and interoperability is not the sole cause of system inefficiency. However, it is a significant and policy-driven contributor. And so by focusing on procurement reform, we can address this issue in a way that is practical, feasible, and one where we can move toward a healthcare system where information flows more effectively and where care delivery improves as a result. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Atta. I'm going to invite Manon to the spotlight.
This subject is not fair. I have a very hard time pronouncing I can't.
I-O. We can say I-O.
I'm francophone, obviously. So I won't say it. I'll do all my comments without saying that word. It's not good. So is the goal to achieve that nationwide, like, or is the goal like if each provincial healthcare system within the system itself was able to go from clinic to hospital and everything worked just fine within one province, would we be satisfied? Or is the idea that everybody across the country needs to use similar systems?
I think ideally we would say across the country, because people can freely move across the country, across jurisdictions. However, I think from a more practical approach, I think it would be better or more feasible if this recommendation was adopted provincially and territorially.
Well,
I know Ontario
I tend to agree with you. I think it would be probably much more feasible in terms like if each province was taking that longer term vision of if, when we replace our faxes in hospital right now, like we can sort of at least have a system that's going to work better. And I was like musing about like what's the role of the federal government in that space? Like, how can we facilitate this? And then I was thinking about Cole's presentation earlier today about all the failures of the federal government in terms of IT systems. Then I was like, well, I'm not sure that's the expertise we want to bring to the table.
I can add just quickly here, if I may. It's interesting, or coincidentally, the federal government I think in February, introduced Bill S5, Connecting Care for Canadians or something. And they basically are putting forward that we should have interoperability standards across the board. And just last Thursday, the Ontario government put forward their budget. And within that, I'm assuming they took sort of that cue, and they are suggesting that we should have a province-wide interoperable electronic health record for family doctors. So they've taken that federal approach, right, and are trying to implement it province-wide. So I think it'll be interesting to see in real time whether or not that's a plausible and feasible solution.
That's interesting. I'm sorry, I'm not aware. Sorry, I opened the website really quickly of the Senate bill, but I mean, I'm assuming I haven't looked at the bill, but I'm assuming it just gives sort of high-level principles. Since it was introduced in the Senate, there would be no money associated with this initiative. So it probably just lays out sort of broad principles. That's an interesting question. What's the sort of federal role in that? I guess my other question, slightly different take, about like the cybersecurity aspects of things, like the more connected the different sort of instruments, tools are, do we introduce a greater risk of if there's a breach of some sort, then all of the data gets sort of captured?
Yeah, I mean, if data is being shared across the board, I think that naturally will increase the risk of cybersecurity threats. And I think within that procurement process, some of those requirements will be to enhance cybersecurity measures to, essentially reduce that risk of any potential threats to privacy.
Because that would be a big part of the social license that you need to develop some sort of a project where Canadians need to feel that their data in these systems is going to be safe. So I mean, that's one thing.
I imagine these type of protocols and requirements are already in place in current procurement practices, it probably will be a matter of enhancing those requirements, perhaps.
No, I really like the sort of like small steps, sort of practical changes, like thinking of the longer term solution, but what steps can we take now to sort of aim towards that longer term goal? I think that's always an approach that can yield big successes in the long term. So well done.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mark, did you want to take a moment to jump in, or?
Am I up? Oh, well, I think I was waiting to see where you would land and cheering for procurement reform. So I was kind of happy to see that in there, because I think it's underutilized in terms of being a policy tool for a bunch of technology change. And I guess the question I had, but maybe we don't have time for it, is what, and maybe it's a bit of a strength that could have been there in the presentation, is I don't quite understand, with whatever solution you pick, but in this case, procurement reform, where is the interoperability challenge? Is it between provinces? Is it between hospitals and doctors' offices? Is it, and so understanding a little bit more about the nature of the tech ecosystem and where the interoperability challenges. I think we all experience them as patients, but where are the broken pieces in the system, and then what would be the particular procurement recommendations that would aim, that would kind of help with that? Because it would where you're looking for interoperability would have a real impact on the particular procurement levers that you would have available to you.
Yeah, so to your first question with respect to where is it broken, it's really broken across the system. For example, something as simple as getting a vaccine through public health. You need to, if you were to go to your family doctor, they would not have that record with them. And likewise, at the hospitals, they wouldn't have that record with them. Let's say, for example, you go to your family doctor and they were to prescribe you a CT scan today. You go and get your CT scan. A month later or 2 months later, you end up going to the hospital, to the ER, and they ask you whether or not you've had a CT scan, and you can't recall. The layperson probably won't be able to recall. And the unfortunate thing, and this is where the negligent part is, or the delay in care, is that a CT scan, for example, is like 20,000 X-rays. So now you've just possibly increased your chances of enhanced radiation, therefore can possibly lead to some sort of carcinogenic effect. And so therefore every part of the healthcare system is not connected. The only part that is really connected is smaller hospital groups. So for example, Unity Health downtown, they have 3 or 4 hospital groups together. They're probably interoperable. UHN, for example, again, few hospitals together, they're probably interoperable, but amongst each other, they can't really talk. And so any individual doesn't necessarily have a preference or doesn't really choose, if they're in an emergency, which hospital they're going to choose, they're going to go to, right? And so if you go to, for example, a hospital under UHN, and tomorrow you were to go to Unity Health, they wouldn't know what your record is, what your past record is, and that can affect the overall provision of healthcare, because when you're providing healthcare, you're looking at a person holistically. And so the system also needs to be holistically connected as well.
Okay. I think that's a good note to wrap up on, and I thank you very much, Atta, for that, and to our judges. I'm actually going to keep the judges in the spotlight, and I'm going to bring Graham in. So first of all, I'd like to thank all of our presenters for their excellent presentations. I hope that this has been an indication for our judges of the caliber of, and for our audience, of the caliber of the soon-to-be graduates of the Master of Public Policy program, class of 2026. I hope that you'll keep them in mind as you think about potential opportunities for policy leadership going forward, and tell all your friends about what great graduates are coming out of this program. But I'd also like to take a moment to thank each of you. Graham, thank you for taking on this responsibility at the very last minute. I'm sure that given that you've had several senior government official positions, you're used to briefing up very quickly, but you briefed up incredibly quickly for this role, and we're all grateful to you for doing so. Manon, you are literally charged with defending democracy for the Privy Council Office of the Government of Canada, and you took an afternoon to spend with us. We're very grateful for your time, for your energy, for your and for taking this role on. I think it's really important for students to hear from people inside government how their ideas and proposals land. And so thank you for sharing your insights with us. Mark, you lead an organization of more than 1,000 people. You are out around the world trying to make major changes to the way that we think about the internet, about artificial intelligence. And I am sure that the opportunity cost of taking an entire afternoon to spend with our students is very high for you. And so we're eminently grateful for your ongoing support, for your wisdom, and for the energy that you bring to these conversations. If people like you did not take the time to engage with our students in the way that you've engaged with them, then I think we take something away from the prospects for future policy leaders. And instead, you gave something to these future policy leaders, and we're all very grateful for your time, your attention, your energy, and for giving back to the policy community. So on behalf of everyone in the MPP program and on behalf of McMaster University, we thank you. And again, congratulations to our students. I think it was you've really shown your mettle, and we're proud of all of you. So a big thanks to everyone. We'll end on time, which is a miracle in and of itself. And we will await our judges' scoring of the presentations. And once that scoring has been received, we'll announce the winners of the Capstone in Digital Society. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Clissom. Thanks, everybody. Just keep on going. We're glad you're
Thank
taking
you.
on these careers in public policy. Really, really great to see everything.
Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.
And congrats on keeping the time.
Thanks to our great presenters. Thank you.